The history we know is often written in broad strokes, dominated by the achievements of kings, warriors, and conquerors. In the midst of grand battles and royal decrees, something, or rather, someone seems to have been left out. If you were to open a medieval history book, you would find page after page dedicated to the lives of men, their wars, their victories, their defeats. The women who lived in this time, those who made their mark on the world, are often absent from these pages. What if these women weren't just passive bystanders, waiting quietly in the shadows of their male counterparts, but active participants in a world far more complex than we've ever been told? You see, the history we have is not all there is. Much of it is a story half told, with large portions of the truth hidden away. The medieval period was a time when women were forced into roles defined by societal expectations, roles that pushed them to the edges of public life. Men, who wrote the records of the time, focused on their own actions, their victories in battle, their political intrigues. But what of the women who were kept behind closed doors, their lives never fully documented, their contributions never acknowledged? These women, in many ways, have been erased from history not by time, but by design. When we talk about medieval women, we're often left with only fragments. The records that chroniclers left behind those invaluable windows into the past are largely silent on the subject of women. The few mentions they did make were often limited to their roles as daughters, wives, or mothers. Rarely do we see them depicted as warriors, thinkers, or leaders. It's as if they didn't exist beyond the walls of their homes. But what if these women weren't confined to domestic spheres after all? What if, in the quiet spaces, behind closed doors and beneath the night sky, they lived lives full of secrets, full of power, and full of influence? As history has been handed down to us, it's as though the chronicles that survived were crafted with one eye fixed firmly on what men did, while women's contributions were either overshadowed or outright erased. Could it be that some of these women played crucial roles in shaping the very course of history, yet their stories were either left untold or deliberately obscured? And if this is the case, what other hidden truths remain buried, locked away beneath centuries of silence? It's hard to imagine now, but the concept of gender during the medieval era was a strict, almost invisible boundary. Women were confined to roles, often invisible in the eyes of chroniclers. They were caretakers, wives, mothers, but they were rarely seen as contributors to society in a larger sense. But even under the weight of these societal constraints, there were those who defied expectations in ways we can scarcely comprehend. Women who shaped events, who took on roles that were considered forbidden, who worked quietly yet powerfully from the shadows. These women were not just passive figures, living under the strict watch of patriarchal norms. They were doing things that went unnoticed, or worse, erased from the pages of history. In the silence of these forgotten women, we begin to understand a hidden world, one that went unnoticed in the hustle of medieval life. What if these women, whose names we may never know, were far more than simple bystanders? What if their true stories have been buried deliberately so by those who wrote history? This mystery, one of lost voices and erased contributions, beckons us to uncover the secrets they left behind. And as we begin to ask questions about their lives, we can't help but wonder, what if everything we've been taught about medieval history was incomplete? What if there are untold stories about these women, waiting to be discovered, buried in the shadows of time? Imagine, for a moment, that these women didn't simply wait for the men to return home. What if their roles in history were far more complex and far more crucial than we have ever been led to believe? And what if their stories have been hidden from us all this time, erased by those who sought to define history only in terms of men's deeds? The truth is there, in the shadows, just waiting to be uncovered. In the chapters that follow, we will walk together into the hidden realms where these women lived and acted, showing you a side of medieval life that has long been forgotten. What they did after dark, when the world slept, may hold the key to understanding their true power. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the world outside settled into the quiet of night, something began to stir in the shadows. The medieval world we know was not one of constant daylight. Nightfall brought with it an entire realm of possibilities, particularly for the women whose stories have long been erased or forgotten. While the men of medieval society rested after their long days of war, politics, or labour, the women carried on in the dark, engaging in roles that would astonish us today. They were not merely caretakers of the hearth or passive bystanders in the fabric of their communities. They were healers, secret religious leaders, and, at times, even the quiet forces behind political change. When the eyes of the world closed, these women found freedom. The night was their canvas, where they could defy the rigid structures that defined their days. Within the privacy of their homes, or in the dimly lit corners of their villages, they were able to act outside the bounds of the prescribed gender roles of the medieval period. What would you find if you could step into their lives during these hours? What if, hidden in the secrecy of darkness, they played roles so powerful that even the most influential chroniclers of the time could not ignore them, yet chose to? What if everything they did was carefully erased, concealed, or minimized in order to maintain a story where men were the only active players? One of the most striking and most mysterious roles these women held was in the realm of healing. As the world slept, many of them remained awake, preparing potions, brewing remedies, and using the knowledge passed down from generations before them. This was not mere domestic medicine, but an art form that blurred the lines between the natural world and the mystical. Some of these women were considered wise, sought after for their knowledge of herbs, remedies, and cures that seemed almost otherworldly. They could heal wounds, ease suffering, and even prolong life with just the touch of their hands or a carefully prepared brew. But such power, particularly in women, was often feared, and so these acts were sometimes labelled as something far darker witchcraft. The line between healer and witch was thin and often invisible in the eyes of medieval society. At times, these women were revered as wise women or healers. At others, they were seen as dangerous figures, their knowledge too potent, their abilities too close to forbidden magic. They often worked alone in the silence of the night, their potions and tinctures hidden away from prying eyes. If a cure worked too well, if their remedies were too successful, whispers might arise, whispers that these women were meddling with forces that should remain untouched. The powers they wielded were not supposed to belong to them, and so the histories we know tell us little of their true contributions. But the night wasn't only for healing. It was also a time for secret religious practices, rituals that defied the doctrines of the church, practices that some women clung to in secret, away from the watchful eyes of male authority. These were the ancient, pre-Christian rituals that had been woven into the fabric of society for centuries, practices that persisted in the hidden corners of the world, even as Christianity sought to stamp them out. These women might have gathered in silence, in the dark, to worship gods and goddesses who had long been forgotten by the mainstream. They spoke of the cycles of the moon, of the earth's deep secrets, of the mysteries that had no place in the official religious order. These were women who refused to conform, who, in their secret rituals, kept alive the ancient wisdom that society was trying to erase. In the dead of night, they were the keepers of knowledge, and their practices held a power that could not be ignored. It was in these secret realms, too, that women sometimes played roles that reached beyond the home, beyond healing, and beyond spirituality. They became players in the political landscape, though few would have ever acknowledged it. They influenced decisions, swayed opinions, and made their voices heard in ways that we can only begin to understand. It was not uncommon for women to manipulate situations from the shadows, quietly steering the course of events without ever stepping into the light. Some of these women were the mothers, wives, and daughters of kings, wielding influence over decisions that shaped kingdoms without ever being seen as the true power behind them. How many medieval conflicts and alliances were influenced by a woman whispering in her husband's ear long after the court had gone silent for the night? These women, though often relegated to the shadows, were in many ways the true architects of society, wielding influence in areas that no chronicler dared to write about. In the stillness of night, they held power that was never meant to be seen. And yet, history has chosen to forget them, choosing instead to honour the deeds of men who, while significant, may not have had the quiet influence these women possessed. What if the key to understanding medieval history lies not in the grand battles, but in the secrets kept in the silence of the night? So, as you drift off into the quiet of the evening, think for a moment about what you don't know about those long-forgotten women of the medieval world. While the men slept, what were these women doing in the shadows? What secrets did they keep, and what powers did they wield that have yet to be uncovered? The answers may be closer than you think. The truth of their stories, hidden away for centuries, may hold the key to understanding more than we could ever have imagined. And as we continue this journey, we will uncover just a few of the mysteries they left behind. In the dimly lit cottages of medieval villages, the air was thick with the scent of dried herbs and the quiet hum of ancient knowledge passed down through generations. Women, particularly those in rural areas, were the custodians of this knowledge, the secret keepers of the earth's hidden powers. While the world around them shifted with the rhythms of war, politics, and religion, these women found solace and purpose in the natural world. Their knowledge of herbs, plants, and remedies became their most valuable possession, one that was often shared only within small circles. It was here, in the shadows of the day, that they wielded power that few understood, and even fewer dared to question. It wasn't just the mundane cures for fever or sore throats that these women were known for. It was the deeper, more mysterious remedies, the kind that could ease a woman's pain during childbirth, or induce a vision when the world became too heavy. These women were skilled in the ancient art of herbalism. Their knowledge gleaned not from texts or libraries, but from the land itself. The roots, leaves, and flowers that grew wild in the forests held secrets, secrets that women learned to unlock. They knew which herbs could treat a wound, which could ease the body's aches, and which could even stir the heart's desires. Some remedies were simple, passed down over years of trial and error, while others seemed almost otherworldly in their effectiveness, suggesting a deeper understanding of nature's hidden mysteries. In times of illness, women were often the first line of defense. They did not wait for a healer to arrive from the city, for there were no doctors to be found in their villages. These women, with their baskets of leaves and roots, became the lifeline for those in need. A feverish child, a father wounded in battle, a neighbour stricken with illness, these women were sought after, revered for their ability to ease suffering and offer hope. But it wasn't just physical healing that they provided. There were whispers of other remedies, ones that could help a person find their way through emotional turmoil or even protect them from dark forces. Yet, this power came with a price. As revered as they were in some circles, these women were equally feared. The very knowledge that made them healers also made them dangerous in the eyes of the church. In a time when the medieval world was firmly under the control of religious doctrine, anything that did not align with the teachings of the church was met with suspicion. A woman who healed with herbs, who knew the secret properties of plants, was walking a fine line. The line between healer and witch was razor thin, and the consequences of crossing it could be dire. The church, ever watchful and intent on controlling all matters of the soul and body, often regarded these women with skepticism. They were seen not as healers, but as practitioners of witchcraft, dabbling in the forbidden. To use herbs and potions was to meddle with forces the church considered unnatural, and in many cases, these women were accused of practicing black magic or invoking spirits. The line between a revered healer and a feared witch was blurred, and often the very knowledge that had saved lives also put these women at risk. The church's teachings held that true healing came from God alone, and anyone who claimed to heal outside of divine intervention was suspect. Yet, despite the suspicion and the dangers that came with their work, there was something undeniably powerful about these women. In a world dominated by men and ruled by religious doctrine, they held a unique kind of power. They were independent, capable of making decisions that directly impacted the lives of others. Their remedies, passed down through generations, became their own form of rebellion against the establishment. And perhaps it was this very defiance, this refusal to be controlled by the teachings of the church, that made them such mysterious and intriguing figures. What did they know that the church refused to accept? What ancient secrets lay hidden in the herbs they gathered and the potions they brewed? The women who practiced this ancient art of healing were not simply caretakers of the sick. They were the silent forces of change in medieval society. They were the ones who bridged the gap between the known and the unknown, between nature's gifts and the fears of a world that didn't fully understand them. But as much as they healed, their role was often misunderstood, and in the eyes of the powerful, they were seen as threats, perhaps because their power was too great to be ignored. As we move forward, we will uncover how some of these women's healing practices were perceived as darker forces at play, blurring the lines between medicine, magic, and rebellion. The truth behind their knowledge, and the dangers it entailed, will become clearer as we delve deeper into the world they inhabited. In the quiet of the medieval night, the village seemed to fall into a kind of uneasy sleep. The fires in the hearths burned low, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves outside, caught in the wind. Yet, in these hushed hours, while most of the world slumbered, certain women were stirring, their actions casting long shadows over the quiet streets. They were the healers, the wise women, the keepers of knowledge that, in a time dominated by fear and superstition, was far too dangerous to remain unchallenged. What had once been a source of reverence soon became the seed of fear. For these women, the very gift of healing became a double-edged sword. The knowledge they held about herbs, potions, and remedies was no longer viewed as a simple form of care, it was seen as something far darker. In a world where the boundaries between faith, power, and the unknown were dangerously thin, these women were often labelled witches, branded as dangerous figures whose connection to the unseen world was feared more than it was understood. But what was it about these women that made them so threatening? Why did the knowledge of herbs, a skill that had been passed down through generations, suddenly become synonymous with evil? The concept of witchcraft in medieval Europe wasn't just about spells or curses. It was tied deeply to the fear of female power. To possess knowledge, especially knowledge that could heal, could control, or could influence others, was to step outside the rigid structures that medieval society had set up. And it was a power that, in the eyes of many, had to be contained. In a world where women were expected to be passive, subservient, and confined to the home, these women represented something dangerous: independence, wisdom, and autonomy. They were a threat not only to the established religious norms, but also to the very fabric of a patriarchal society that feared the idea of women holding power over their own lives. As the years went on, these women's roles became more dangerous in the eyes of both the church and the state. Accusations of witchcraft, whether for healing or for simply stepping outside accepted norms, grew in frequency. The medieval church had no tolerance for anything it couldn't control, and the mystical and natural powers that women wielded through the herbs they gathered, the potions they brewed, and the knowledge they carried became symbols of rebellion. Women who could heal the sick were seen as wielding dangerous influence, and those who used plants to alleviate pain or induce visions were perceived as meddling with forces that belonged only to the divine. The persecution of these women wasn't a random act. It was a coordinated effort to silence a form of power that threatened to undo centuries of social order. Witch trials, once rare, became increasingly common, fueled by fear, superstition, and a deep-seated need to control women's independence. Women who dared to exercise this forbidden knowledge were often accused of pacts with the devil, of using their gifts for dark purposes, and of subverting the authority of the church. The trials were brutal, and the methods of proving witchcraft were horrifyingly arbitrary. To be accused was often a death sentence, and the trials themselves were less about truth and more about maintaining control over a society that was fearful of what these women represented. But what was it about these women that so terrified the medieval world? Why did the very act of knowledge, particularly knowledge, passed down through generations of women, become the catalyst for such widespread fear? It was because, in the eyes of those in power, these women were dangerous not because they were witches in the conventional sense, but because they threatened the established order. The church, the patriarchs, the rulers, they all feared that the power of these women could undermine the very systems that held society together. Their knowledge, their independence, and their ability to heal, to act, and to influence were seen as a subversion of the control that had been carefully built over centuries. And yet, it wasn't just fear of witchcraft that drove the persecution of these women. It was also the need to eliminate any form of power that didn't align with the patriarchal vision of society. These women were independent, often living on the edges of society, and they operated outside the boundaries of what was acceptable. They had the knowledge and the courage to challenge the very institutions that were built to control them, and for that, they had to be silenced. As these women became targets of persecution, their stories began to fade from history, lost in the wake of accusations, trials, and executions. But as we examine the role these women played in the medieval world, we begin to understand that their secret knowledge, whether it was rooted in healing or rebellion, was far more powerful than we have been led to believe. In the next chapter, we will explore how these women's knowledge wasn't just about healing, it was about shaping society, influencing politics, and challenging the very systems that sought to control them. Their roles, hidden from history, reveal a power that still reverberates through time. In the flickering candlelight of medieval castles, as the men of the court discussed wars and politics, there were women who worked quietly in the shadows, pulling the strings that influenced the fate of entire kingdoms. These women were not mere bystanders in the drama of medieval life. They were active participants, wielding power from behind the scenes in ways that history has often overlooked or deliberately obscured. While many were relegated to domestic duties during the day, after dark, their influence extended far beyond the walls of the household, shaping the political landscape in ways that few have ever acknowledged. The medieval court, a place of intrigue, ambition, and power struggles was not as male-dominated as history often suggests. Beneath the surface of knights, kings, and generals, women, particularly those of noble birth, played a central role in the machinations of the court. They were not simply passive figures, waiting for decisions to be made for them. They were often the architects of decisions, using their positions to manipulate events in ways that could alter the course of history. In a time when the lives of women were mostly confined to the domestic sphere, the political power these women wielded was, at best, barely acknowledged, and at worst, deliberately ignored. Take, for example, Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe. As the wife of two kings, first Louis VII of France and then Henry II of England, Eleanor was not simply a passive figurehead, she was an active political force. During the years of her marriage to Henry, she exercised considerable influence, not only in matters of the English throne, but across the entire Angevin Empire. Eleanor arranged strategic marriages, formed alliances, and even played a crucial role in political affairs, sometimes against the wishes of her husband. She was a queen with her own agenda, one that she pursued with a keen sense of strategy. Her ability to manipulate the political scene was not just a matter of her position, but also her understanding of how power worked in a world where women's voices were often silenced. Eleanor's story, though well known to some, is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the untold stories of women who used their status to manipulate power. There were countless others lesser known, but no less influential, who worked behind the scenes to arrange marriages, broker peace, and influence the rise and fall of monarchs. These women, while sometimes overshadowed by their male counterparts, wielded a quiet but formidable force. They understood that true power often lay in shaping events from the shadows, in controlling the strings that others failed to see. Their influence could be felt not just in the courts, but on the battlefields, as alliances and enmities shifted according to the plans they orchestrated. One such figure is the Empress Matilda, the daughter of King Henry I of England, who was poised to inherit the throne after her father's death. However, her claim was contested by her cousin Stephen of Blois, leading to a bitter civil war. Matilda, despite being a woman in a world that denied women the throne, did not sit idly by. Instead, she fought fiercely for her birthright, and though she never officially reigned, her political maneuvers, managing armies, forming alliances, and even taking control of the city of London shaped English history in profound ways. She demonstrated that political influence was not confined to the throne, but could be wielded by women who understood the value of strategic thinking and covert action. Beyond their role in royal marriages and court intrigues, these women also influenced the course of wars, some even using their positions to sway the decisions of generals and rulers. In an era where wars were often fought over alliances forged through marriage or political maneuvering, the women involved in these unions held extraordinary sway. By arranging the marriages of their daughters or sons, they ensured that alliances remained strong, and that kingdoms could rise or fall based on the strategic decisions made in the silence of the drawing room, away from the eyes of the public. The influence of women in these covert political maneuvers was not limited to queens or noblewomen. In many cases, women from lower ranks also found ways to impact the political sphere, particularly when they were married to powerful men or held influential roles within their communities. These women used their influence in more subtle ways, often operating within the boundaries of accepted norms while secretly shaping events behind the scenes. Their actions might not have been recorded in the official histories, but they were no less significant in the long run. In an age when the written word was often reserved for chroniclers who favoured the stories of kings and knights, the contributions of women were often relegated to the margins or entirely erased. Their influence in the political world was hidden, overshadowed by the actions of men who were more visible, more celebrated, and more frequently documented. Yet, when we peel back the layers of history, it becomes clear that these women were not passive bystanders, but were active participants in shaping the world around them. Their influence was as potent as it was invisible, and it played a crucial role in the political dramas of the time. As we consider these women, their power, and the ways in which they influenced the course of history, we begin to see a new dimension to the medieval world, a dimension where women were not just wives, mothers, and daughters, but active, influential figures who navigated the complex web of politics and power with skill, intelligence, and determination. Their influence, while often hidden in the shadows of history, was profound. And as we move forward, we'll uncover how this secretive power was also intertwined with the spiritual and religious practices of the time where women not only shaped political outcomes but also influenced the very beliefs that governed their societies. As the moon rose high in the sky, casting its pale light over the medieval countryside, the world seemed to fall into a deep, tranquil sleep. Yet, beneath the quiet surface of this peaceful night, something far more mysterious was taking place, something that, if discovered, would shake the very foundations of the church and the societal order. In the stillness of the night, women were gathering in secret, engaging in rituals and practices that were not only forbidden by the church but were also deeply tied to ancient, pagan beliefs that had long been suppressed. These women were not just performing ceremonies, they were reclaiming ancient spiritual traditions, defying the newly established religious order that sought to erase them. The rise of Christianity in medieval Europe did not come without a cost. As the church expanded its influence, ancient beliefs often tied to the cycles of nature, the reverence of the earth, and the worship of feminine deities were driven into hiding. Pagan rituals that had once been practiced openly were now outlawed, condemned as heresy, and associated with the dark arts. Yet, for many women, the pull of these ancient traditions was too strong to ignore. In the dead of night, when the eyes of the world were closed, they gathered in secret places, the forests, the caves, or the corners of their own homes, to perform rituals that harked back to an older time. These rituals were not just acts of devotion, they were acts of rebellion. They were a defiance of the Church's authority and its attempts to reshape the spiritual landscape of Europe. For many of these women, the rites they practiced were tied to the earth itself, symbolizing life, death, fertility, and renewal. They believed in the power of nature, the energies that flowed through the earth, and the divine feminine, which had been at the center of spiritual practice long before the advent of Christianity. By participating in these clandestine rituals, they not only connected with their ancestors, but also asserted their own power in a world that sought to silence them. The secrecy surrounding these rituals was paramount. Women, often marginalized and relegated to the private sphere, found solace in these sacred practices that offered them a space of empowerment and spiritual autonomy. While the Church preached the virtue of humility and submission, these rituals celebrated the strength and independence of women. It was in the dark of night, away from the watchful eyes of the clergy, that they could express their spirituality freely without fear of persecution or punishment. These women were not just followers of a forbidden faith, they were the keepers of a knowledge that had been passed down for centuries, a knowledge that was viewed with increasing suspicion by the Church. The practices they engaged in often defied the established norms. There were offerings made to the moon, to nature's elements, and to female deities who represented wisdom, fertility, and creation. The rituals could be simple, like the lighting of candles in reverence of the changing seasons, or more elaborate, involving dances, chants, and invocations of powers that were believed to be hidden deep within the earth and the cosmos. Some of these practices involved the use of sacred herbs, plants that, in the right hands, had the power to heal, transform, or even transcend ordinary human experiences. In a world where medicine and magic were often indistinguishable, these women's deep knowledge of plants and their spiritual uses became both a source of power and a point of conflict. But what was it about these rituals that made them so dangerous in the eyes of the Church? The Church, which sought to consolidate spiritual power under its own teachings, viewed these practices as a direct threat to its authority. To the Church, these rituals were not just heretical, they were seen as a challenge to the very foundation of Christian beliefs. They represented an alternative worldview, one where women held spiritual authority and the earth itself was revered as sacred. These practices were connected to the ancient reverence for the feminine divine, a force that the Church had worked tirelessly to suppress. The Church's fear of these rituals went beyond spiritual concerns. It was rooted in the idea that these women, by participating in these practices, were claiming power that was rightfully reserved for men and the Church. Women were not supposed to hold such spiritual autonomy. They were not supposed to have access to knowledge that could heal, protect, or empower them in ways that defied the teachings of the Church. And yet, these women defied all expectations, practicing their forbidden faith in secret, in the dead of night, away from the prying eyes of their communities. The threat posed by these women's secret spiritual practices was not just about religion, it was about power. By keeping these ancient rituals alive, these women were asserting their right to spiritual and personal freedom in a society that was intent on controlling both. The Church's desire to erase these practices was not merely about eradicating heresy. It was about silencing a power that threatened the very social structure the Church sought to uphold. The spiritual independence of women, this hidden, clandestine force, was seen as a direct challenge to the patriarchal system that had long been in place. As we delve deeper into these forbidden practices, we begin to see a pattern emerge, the link between spirituality and rebellion. These women, by practicing in secret, not only defied religious authority, but also resisted the constraints that society placed on them. Their rituals, their knowledge of herbs, their connection to the earth, all of these elements became symbols of resistance. And as we move forward, we will explore how these women's spiritual practices were not only acts of personal devotion, but were, in many cases, intertwined with broader movements of social and political defiance, setting the stage for the struggles that would unfold in the centuries to come. The clamour of rebellion, the uprising of voices that refuse to remain silent. These are often the sounds we associate with men, with soldiers marching and leaders rallying troops. But what if the true strength of many revolts was not solely in the hands of the men who led them, but also in the quiet, unseen efforts of the women who stood behind the scenes? These women, though often excluded from the official narratives of history, played a crucial role in shaping the course of revolts, uprisings, and resistance movements. Their contributions were not always recorded, not always acknowledged, but they were no less significant. From orchestrating secret meetings in the shadows to rallying support in their communities, these women influenced the course of events in ways that remain largely hidden in the margins of history. While the men of medieval Europe were often seen as the soldiers on the front lines, the women were the ones who organized, motivated, and sometimes even directly engaged in acts of rebellion. They were the ones who, from the safety of their homes, communicated with rebels, provided support for movements, and acted as vital links between different groups in times of unrest. The household, often viewed as the most private and mundane space, became a stage for political action. Women wielded influence over their families, communities, and sometimes even their husbands, subtly pushing them toward acts of resistance. They knew how to use the power of their position within the home and in society to rally others to a cause without drawing attention to themselves. Take, for example, the role of women in the English peasants' revolt of 1381. While most records highlight the men who marched in the streets of London, demanding justice and an end to harsh taxation, the women of the rebellion were integral to its success. These women were not fighting on the front lines with swords in hand, but their contributions were no less impactful. Women in the villages played key roles in organizing the protest, spreading word of the revolt, and providing logistical support to the peasants who would rise against their rulers. In times of revolution, women became the voices in the shadows, quietly steering events from the safety of their homes and hearths. But women didn't only play roles behind closed doors, they also took to the streets, often incognito or disguised as men. While many women's involvement in rebellion has gone unrecorded, there are moments in history where their actions have been revealed, and their bravery is apparent. The women who secretly helped fuel revolts across Europe were not passive in their defiance. They were strategists, supporters, and at times, even fighters. The medieval world, with its tight grip on gender roles, was not one that easily allowed women to step into the limelight of revolt. And yet, many did so anyway, though their stories were often lost to time. The city of Paris in the early 14th century saw women play an essential role in several uprisings, one of which was the 1358 Jacquerie, a peasant revolt against the nobility. While the men were the primary rebels, many women were also central to the movement, helping with the distribution of food, organizing protests, and providing the emotional and physical support that sustained the fighters. It is clear that these women were not simply passive observers in the face of great injustice, but active participants in a revolution that aimed to shift the balance of power. There were also women who led in their own right, figures like Joan of Arc, who stood on the front lines of battle, not just as a symbol of resistance, but as a leader. While Joan's story is one of the few where the woman's role in a military campaign is widely acknowledged, there were countless other women who, like her, took part in rebellion, though they often did so in ways that history has tried to erase or diminish. Whether rallying support from the sidelines or making critical decisions in the midst of conflict, these women played pivotal roles in the revolts that shaped medieval history. Despite their significant contributions, however, women's involvement in rebellion was often underreported or misrepresented. Chroniclers, who were predominantly male, recorded history from a lens that favored the actions of men. Women, especially those engaged in resistance, were often omitted from the official accounts, their roles minimized or erased entirely. Even when women did take center stage in revolt, their contributions were frequently overshadowed by the men who were deemed the official leaders of the movement. Their stories were relegated to footnotes, and their bravery forgotten in the wake of more visible figures. The result was a historical narrative that largely ignored the influence women had in shaping political change during the medieval period. However, as we look closer at these women's roles, we begin to understand that their resistance was not just a series of isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern of women challenging the power structures that sought to control them. These women were rebels, not just in the conventional sense, but in the most subtle ways, organizing, influencing, and taking action in spaces where their voices were not supposed to be heard. They used their influence to challenge authority, to disrupt the established order, and to demand change. Their rebellion wasn't just about fighting for a cause, it was about resisting a system that wanted to silence them. As we continue this exploration, we see how the role of women in these acts of rebellion was critical not just in the moments of uprising, but in the broader power dynamics of medieval society. The women who fought for justice, freedom, and equality, whether on the streets, in the homes, or from the shadows, shaped the course of history in ways that have often gone unrecognized. Their influence, though often hidden, was powerful. And in the next chapter, we'll explore how these women's roles were not just spiritual or political, but also intertwined with the larger, societal forces that sought to suppress their voices altogether. Their influence may have been quietly suppressed, but it was never truly extinguished. In the early days of medieval Europe, women held positions of considerable influence. They were not just daughters, wives, or mothers. They were spiritual leaders, business owners, and even political strategists. Their roles were woven into the fabric of society, often in ways that went beyond the confines of the private sphere. Women could rise to positions of power in religious orders, manage estates and resources, and contribute to the governance of local communities. But as the centuries wore on, something began to shift. The rise of patriarchy, with its rigid gender roles and hierarchical structures, began to systematically push women out of the public eye. The more that male-dominated power structures gained control, the more women's roles once central to the functioning of society became marginalized and, at times, erased altogether. This gradual shift was not just a natural evolution of society, but a deliberate reordering of power dynamics. As Christianity spread throughout Europe, the Church played a pivotal role in redefining women's place within the social and religious spheres. Once, in the pre-Christian era, women held positions of spiritual significance, often revered as healers, priestesses, and guardians of sacred knowledge. They were integral to the worship of the divine, celebrated not just as mothers, but as powerful, independent figures. In many ancient traditions, women were worshipped as embodiments of fertility, wisdom, and creation. But as the Church consolidated power, this view began to change. Women were no longer seen as divine or sacred figures, but as subordinates to men and, at times, even as sources of sin and temptation. The Church's influence grew as its doctrines began to spread across the European continent. In an attempt to establish a more controlled, monolithic religious system, the Church sought to reshape how women were viewed by society. No longer were they to be seen as powerful figures, keepers of ancient knowledge, or agents of spiritual change, but as passive, obedient servants of both their husbands and God. Women's roles became more tightly confined to the home, and any attempt to challenge this new social order was met with increasing hostility. The once empowered women who had thrived in the earlier centuries, who wielded influence both in public and private spheres, found themselves pushed to the periphery. Their spiritual practices were labelled as witchcraft, their influence in politics dismissed as mere manipulation, and their business acumen overshadowed by the authority of men. Take, for example, the transition from the era of powerful female rulers to the slow erosion of female political power during the medieval period. In earlier times, royal women such as Eleanor of Aquitaine or Empress Matilda had held significant sway in both politics and warfare. Yet, as patriarchal systems took hold, the narrative of female rulers slowly faded. The women who had once controlled vast estates, acted as diplomats, and brokered crucial political marriages were increasingly seen as anomalies, exceptions to the rule. Over time, their power was not just diminished but ignored. In the official histories written by male chroniclers, these women were often reduced to mere footnotes in the stories of their male counterparts, their achievements overshadowed and obscured. The suppression of women's power wasn't just a matter of pushing them out of politics, it was a complete redefinition of their very existence within society. Women were no longer seen as capable of independent thought or action. Instead, they were reduced to their roles within the family. The Church, which held tremendous sway over every aspect of medieval life, reinforced this shift by labeling women as weaker vessels, fit only for domestic duties and subservience to men. The ideal woman, according to the Church, was chaste, obedient, and silent. Women who defied these ideals, whether through political engagement, spiritual leadership, or the use of knowledge to heal, were often branded as dangerous, even heretical. One of the most profound ways this marginalization occurred was through the systematic erasure of women's contributions to history. Throughout the medieval period, female leaders, scholars, and healers were written out of official accounts, or their roles diminished to mere footnotes. The female voices that once told the stories of healing, of community leadership, of rebellion, were silenced by the male-dominated histories that followed. The very language of history recorded by monks and scholars was shaped to exclude or downplay women's influence. What we are left with are sanitized, incomplete accounts of history, where women's contributions are either invisible or overshadowed by the actions of men. Yet, the suppression of women's power didn't only take place through religious or political channels. It was also embedded in the very structure of medieval society. Laws were enacted to limit women's economic independence, education was restricted, and social norms were carefully crafted to ensure women remained subordinate. The legal systems that emerged in the wake of Christian rule imposed stricter controls on women's property rights, marriage, and sexual autonomy. While men were free to exercise power, women's roles were more and more defined by their relationship to men, whether as daughters, wives, or widows. Even in religious orders, women's spiritual influence was slowly eroded. Nuns, once revered as spiritual leaders in their own right, found their roles constrained by the growing influence of the Church. Instead of leading religious ceremonies or making theological contributions, many nuns were relegated to performing menial tasks within the convent. The female monastic experience, once one of empowerment and leadership, became a symbol of submission and penitence, stripped of its original significance. The result of this growing patriarchal system was the gradual disappearance of women's contributions from the historical record. Women were forced into smaller, more confined spaces of influence, and their larger roles in shaping society, culture, and religion were systematically erased. The history we have today is one that has been shaped not just by time, but by a concerted effort to suppress the power of women in medieval society. And as we uncover these hidden truths, we begin to see the depth of the erasure and the far-reaching consequences of this suppression. As we move forward, we will explore the mechanisms through which these women's stories were erased from history, and how their roles, both public and private, were distorted, repressed, and misrepresented. The truth about women's power in medieval Europe may be more complex and more shocking than we have been led to believe. History, as we know it, is not a straightforward account of the past. It is, in many ways, a carefully constructed narrative. What we read in history books, what we're taught in classrooms, and what we see in the archives often tell only a partial truth. What if the past we know is a lie? What if, over time, the most powerful women in history, the ones who shaped the course of events, who wielded influence in ways men did not, were deliberately hidden from view? What if the true stories of these women, who were once central figures in their societies, were erased not by time, but by design? For centuries, the contributions of women in medieval Europe were actively suppressed, their voices silenced, and their roles misrepresented or completely erased. One of the primary ways this was accomplished was through the destruction of texts and records. The medieval period was dominated by chroniclers, scribes, and religious authorities, many of whom were men, writing from their own biases and societal norms. The vast majority of the written word from this time comes from the Church, which had its own agenda. The religious order sought to control not only the faith of the people but also their narratives. It was easier to maintain control when the stories were simplified and shaped to favor a patriarchal view of the world. Women, with their independent roles and powerful influence, were often portrayed as either passive or absent, their true significance hidden behind layers of misrepresentation. The most significant way this erasure took place was through the selective destruction of texts. In a time when the written word was power, religious and political authorities often controlled what was recorded and, more importantly, what was allowed to survive. Female authors, philosophers, and theologians whose works challenged the accepted social order were systematically silenced. Manuscripts that documented women's contributions were often destroyed, either deliberately by the church or lost over time due to neglect. The few that did survive were edited, redacted, or misrepresented. Chroniclers and scribes, often working under the direct supervision of the clergy, rarely gave women the credit they deserved for their contributions to society, politics, or spirituality. Instead, they relegated them to the margins or ignored them altogether. It wasn't just the physical loss of historical documents that contributed to the erasure of women's lives, it was also the cultural shift that took place over the course of the medieval period. As Christianity spread throughout Europe, the role of women in society was drastically redefined. Once celebrated in ancient religions for their wisdom, strength, and spiritual power, women found themselves confined to increasingly narrow roles. In the eyes of the church, women were seen as inherently inferior to men, their power and influence diminished. The growing patriarchal structures in society led to a cultural perception that women were to be seen and not heard, with their roles primarily relegated to the private sphere. In this environment, the stories of women's achievements were actively omitted or minimized. Women who played key roles in the political and social realms, those who mediated in royal courts, influenced the outcome of wars, or held spiritual authority, were either ignored in official records or their contributions were credited to the men around them. Take, for example, the powerful women who served as regents, managing entire kingdoms while their husbands or fathers were away. Their leadership, though vital to the success of these realms, was often overshadowed by the male rulers who were officially in power. Women who held estates, managed resources, and conducted business were often written out of economic histories, with their success attributed to male family members or dismissed as a mere extension of their domestic duties. Even in religious matters, where women once played vital roles as nuns, abbesses, and spiritual leaders, their influence was systematically reduced. The church initially allowed some space for women in monastic life, but over time, their power in these institutions was diminished. Women's contributions to religious scholarship, such as the works of Hildegard of Bingen, were overlooked, and their writings were often dismissed as mere eccentricities. Those who challenged the dominant theology or spiritual practices were labelled heretics or witches, their voices stifled and their legacies buried. But it wasn't just the loss of records that contributed to the silencing of women's stories. It was also the ways in which the histories that did survive were shaped. Chroniclers, when they did mention women at all, typically portrayed them as passive figures, either as the dutiful wives and mothers of kings, or as the temptresses who led men astray. If a woman did make a political move or engage in warfare, her actions were often framed as exceptions or anomalies, as though such behavior was so outside the norm that it required special mention. Women who were engaged in significant social, political, or cultural movements were often dismissed as pawns of the men around them. Their independence, intelligence, and influence were minimized or ignored in favor of stories that reinforced the power structures of the time. The consequences of this erasure were far-reaching. By excluding women from the official historical record, a distorted view of the past was created, one that reinforced the notion that men were the only active agents in history. The result is that, for centuries, the true role of women in shaping medieval society remained hidden. Their contributions to religion, politics, medicine, and culture were lost, and their voices became faint whispers, drowned out by the louder narratives of male-dominated history. As we examine the systematic erasure of women's lives and contributions in the medieval period, we begin to understand just how deeply ingrained this omission was in the historical record. The silencing of women's voices was not merely an accident of history. It was a deliberate act, designed to maintain a social order that placed men at the center of power. The loss of these records is not just a tragedy of forgotten histories, but a reminder of the power structures that sought to control not only what was remembered, but who got to tell the story. And in the chapters to come, we will delve deeper into how these hidden histories are slowly being uncovered, how women's voices, once silenced, are beginning to rise again. The truth about their roles in shaping society may have been buried for centuries, but it is far from lost. The echoes of the medieval world reach far into the present, and in many ways, they continue to shape our understanding of history, gender, and power. What if uncovering the hidden roles of medieval women could change everything we know about the past and the present? The rediscovery of these erased women, whose stories were deliberately hidden or misrepresented, holds the potential to not only reshape how we view medieval society, but also how we understand modern concepts of gender, authority, and the very fabric of human history. For centuries, the absence of women from the historical narrative has created a skewed vision of the past. Without recognizing the contributions of women, we have built a world where history often feels incomplete, as though we are only seeing one side of the coin. This lack of visibility has led to pervasive myths and misunderstandings about women's roles throughout history. Women were often portrayed as passive, submissive figures, either wives, daughters, or mothers, while men took the spotlight as the leaders, warriors, and thinkers. This false narrative has affected how society views gender roles today, reinforcing outdated stereotypes about women's abilities and place in the world. Yet, as modern scholars, historians, and archaeologists uncover the long-lost stories of medieval women, a new narrative is beginning to take shape, one that challenges the traditional, patriarchal view of history and society. Feminist scholars have been at the forefront of this rediscovery, seeking out the overlooked, suppressed, and forgotten stories of women who wielded power, influence, and intelligence in ways that history has long ignored. These scholars are delving into ancient texts, legal documents, and archaeological finds that reveal the true depth of women's participation in medieval life. From political leaders and religious figures to healers, warriors, and philosophers, the rediscovery of these women is not just an academic endeavor, it is a cultural revolution. In the last few decades, new scholarship has emerged that brings to light the powerful roles women played in medieval society. For example, historians have unearthed the stories of noble women who governed vast estates, made political alliances, and even participated in battles. One such figure is Isabella of Castile, who not only ruled the Kingdom of Castile, but also played a central role in the unification of Spain and the funding of Columbus's voyage to the New World. Another example is the Abbess Hildegard of Bingen, whose theological writings, medical knowledge, and music were groundbreaking for her time. Yet, for centuries, figures like these were relegated to the sidelines of history, their achievements overshadowed by their male counterparts. Archaeologists, too, are making important contributions to this ongoing cultural shift. Through the discovery of medieval artifacts, burial sites, and even hidden manuscripts, they are revealing the ways in which women were integral to medieval society. For instance, archaeologists have uncovered evidence that women were active participants in religious rituals, often holding positions of spiritual authority in monastic communities. Some of these women, like the abbesses of medieval convents, wielded power not just within their religious communities but also within the larger political and social landscape. These findings are challenging the narrative that women's power was confined to the domestic sphere, showing instead that their influence reached far beyond the walls of their homes. The impact of rediscovering these erased women is profound, not only because it uncovers lost histories, but because it directly challenges modern cultural assumptions about gender and power. For centuries, women have been relegated to the margins of history, their contributions overlooked, their voices silenced. But as these women are brought back into the story, it forces us to reconsider our understanding of power itself. Power, it turns out, was not the exclusive domain of men. It was not only those who fought in wars or ruled kingdoms who shaped the course of history. It was also the women who healed, who led in secret, and who influenced the lives of those around them in quieter, yet equally important ways. The ripple effect of these revelations is already being felt in contemporary culture. As the true roles of women in history are brought to light, modern perspectives on gender are being reshaped. The idea that women were mere passive observers of history is being replaced with the recognition that they were active agents, wielding power in ways that were just as significant as their male counterparts. This shift in understanding is not limited to academia, it extends into popular culture as well. Films, books, and documentaries are beginning to tell the stories of these hidden women, offering the public a more nuanced, accurate view of the past. The rediscovery of medieval women is challenging the status quo and inspiring a new generation of thinkers, leaders, and activists to rethink the roles women can play in society. But the work is far from done. There are still countless stories to uncover, hidden beneath layers of history, waiting to be brought to light. As we continue to peel back the veil of silence that has surrounded these women, we can expect to see even more profound changes in how we understand the medieval world, as well as the world we live in today. The more we uncover, the more we see how the historical erasure of women has shaped our modern understanding of power, gender, and history itself. By reclaiming these lost stories, we are not just recovering the past, we are reshaping the future. As we look forward, we must ask ourselves how these rediscovered roles could have influenced the societal structure of the medieval world. What if the true power of medieval society lay not just in the hands of kings and warriors, but in the silent resistance and quiet influence of women? The next chapter will explore how these women, whose roles were both political and spiritual, shaped the very fabric of medieval life, and how their hidden power ultimately challenged the structures that sought to keep them in the shadows. In the eyes of many, the medieval household was a place of quiet submission for women. The image of women in the public eye was one of subordination. Dutiful wives, mothers, and caretakers, their roles confined to the domestic sphere, with little influence outside the walls of their homes. But what if this widely accepted view of the medieval woman was wrong? What if the true power within medieval households didn't lie with the men, as history often suggests, but with the women who worked tirelessly behind closed doors, shaping the economy, the social structure, and even the survival of the family? The untold truth of women's roles within the household will shock you. While men were often the ones celebrated as public figures, warriors, landowners, kings, and traders, women quietly held significant power in the private, domestic world. In the medieval period, the household was the central unit of life, and within that sphere, women were the key players in ensuring its stability. Women were responsible for managing the household economy, making critical decisions that affected the family's well-being, and often working from dawn until dusk to keep the home running smoothly. Their labor was not only physical but also economic, as they oversaw a range of activities from cooking and cleaning to managing finances, organizing labor, and running businesses. Consider, for example, the role of women in agriculture. While men were often seen as the primary workers in the fields, women were equally involved in managing the land, overseeing planting and harvesting, and ensuring that crops were grown and properly maintained. In rural communities, women were responsible for the day-to-day operations of the household, which included managing the food supply, producing goods, and distributing resources. Women frequently worked alongside their husbands in the fields or in the marketplace, but they also played key roles in decision-making, ensuring that crops were cultivated and that the family had enough resources to survive. Even in urban areas, women often played critical economic roles. Many women worked as independent traders or artisans, running businesses that ranged from selling goods in the market to creating and selling textiles, pottery, and other handmade items. In towns and cities, women's workshops, often run from their homes, contributed significantly to the local economy. Women could be found running taverns, weaving cloth, or brewing ale activities that brought them into the public sphere, but were still deeply tied to the home and its economy. These businesses were not simply an extension of the husband's work, but rather independent endeavors that gave women a degree of economic autonomy. One of the most significant aspects of a medieval woman's role within the household was her control over the family's finances. While men were often responsible for larger-scale transactions, it was women who managed the day-to-day expenses of the household. They ensured that there was enough food to last through the winter, that the children were clothed and educated, and that the household ran efficiently. Women's ability to manage money was often underestimated, but it was, in fact, crucial to the survival of the family unit. In times of hardship or scarcity, it was often the woman who found a way to stretch resources, to barter for goods, or to run a small business to supplement the family income. One such example can be found in the life of Marjorie Kempe, a medieval woman who defied the conventional roles of her time. Despite her position as a wife and mother, she took an active role in managing her family's finances, engaging in business ventures, and even traveling as a pilgrim to raise money for her family. Her story shows how women could influence the economic stability of their households, not only through domestic labor, but through their business acumen and resourcefulness. Marjorie's ability to navigate both the private and public spheres demonstrates the fluidity with which women could move between the two realms, shaping their family's fortunes from within the household. Another example is that of Eleanor of Aquitaine, a woman whose influence extended far beyond the household, but whose early life and marriage demonstrated the power women could hold in managing estates. When Eleanor married Henry II of England, she not only brought vast wealth and land into the marriage, but she also managed these assets effectively. Eleanor's ability to oversee such a large estate and negotiate political and economic matters on behalf of her family set her apart from the traditional image of women in medieval society. Her actions show that women were not passive figures in the household, but rather crucial players in shaping the economy and power structures of their time. But it wasn't only noble women who wielded this kind of power. In every class of medieval society, women were key to the success of the household and the local economy. While men might have been the ones to wield swords or settle matters of war and politics, it was often the women who maintained the foundation of society, the home, the community, and the economy. From the smallest village to the largest city, women's influence could be felt everywhere, though it was often overlooked or misunderstood by chroniclers of the time. They were the unseen force that kept the social machinery running smoothly, guiding families through times of peace and hardship alike. These women were not simply caretakers. They were active managers of both the economic and social life within their homes and communities. They were essential to the functioning of medieval society, their contributions often hidden from the historical record. The power they exercised was not grand or public, but it was deeply influential, shaping the daily lives of families and communities. What we often fail to see is that the real power in medieval households wasn't with the men, but with the women working in silence, making decisions that affected not just their families, but the broader social fabric. As we shift our focus to the next section, we will see how these women, while integral to the survival of the family, also played key roles in the broader community. From managing businesses to working alongside men in various trades, women were not only domestic figures, but also active contributors to the economic and social landscape. Their influence stretched far beyond the walls of their homes, setting the stage for the exploration of women's roles in the community at large. The power they wielded within the household was only the beginning of their significant impact on medieval society. In the bustling markets and lively town squares of medieval Europe, women were not just passive participants in the daily transactions of life. They were driving forces behind the local economies, social structures, and even political decisions. While much of history has focused on the roles of men in shaping the broader society, the true power of women in these communities often went unnoticed, obscured by the larger-than-life figures of kings, knights, and warriors. But what if medieval women were the real leaders of their communities, shaping the economy and politics in ways history ignored? In towns and villages, women were central to the economic activity that defined medieval life. They were not only the caretakers of their households, but were also key players in the market, engaging in trade, craftwork, and small-scale industry. In medieval Europe, the marketplace was the lifeblood of the community, and women were often the ones managing the day-to-day exchanges that kept it alive. From selling goods at market stalls to weaving cloth, making pottery, and brewing ale, women ran businesses that were integral to the local economy. These women were not just supporting their families through their work, they were building the economic foundation of their towns. The market was a place where women exercised considerable influence, not only as traders but as entrepreneurs in their own right. It was common for women to run shops, sell, produce, or manage small-scale industries that produced food, textiles, and household goods. In some cases, these women even held exclusive rights to certain trades or goods in the market, allowing them to wield significant economic power. For example, women in medieval cities like London or Paris often ran inns, taverns, or bakeries, businesses that were essential to the functioning of the local economy and the social fabric of the town. These women were business owners, traders, and leaders who actively shaped their communities, even though their influence was rarely acknowledged in historical accounts. But women's roles in the market weren't just limited to trade, they extended into craftwork and artisanal production as well. Many women were skilled weavers, spinners, dyers, and potters, producing goods that were highly valued in their towns and beyond. These crafts were often passed down through generations, with women working within family-run workshops or guilds. Women who were involved in craftwork did not only support their families financially, they also became integral parts of the local economy, contributing to the trade and distribution of goods that supported entire towns. They formed networks of commerce that helped sustain the community, using their skills and knowledge to build social and economic ties. While women were often confined to these roles in the public sphere, they also used their influence to shape social norms and manage resources within their communities. For many women, their work in the market or as business owners gave them the opportunity to participate in communal gatherings and engage in local politics. In some medieval towns, women were allowed to join local councils or participate in town meetings, where they could influence decisions that affected the welfare of the community. They might not have been formally recognized as political leaders, but their actions had a profound impact on the local governance, particularly in matters of taxation, trade regulations, and community affairs. One such example of women's political involvement can be seen in the role of women in the medieval city of Ghent in the 14th century. During a period of economic upheaval, women in Ghent played a significant role in organizing protests and uprisings against local authorities. They used their economic influence in the market and their positions within guilds to rally support for the political changes they sought. These women were not merely subjects of political movements, they were active participants in shaping the course of events in their town. Moreover, the social networks that women built through their businesses and trade were often vehicles for influence. Women who ran businesses or held key positions in the marketplace became influential figures within their communities. They would often be called upon to mediate disputes, offer advice, and provide counsel in matters of local importance. These women's roles extended far beyond the private sphere, giving them a voice in the shaping of social norms and community governance. The role of women in the market and public spaces was also tied to the maintenance of family and community life. In addition to their economic contributions, women were often seen as moral and social leaders, ensuring that the community upheld shared values and principles. They were involved in organizing local religious events, festivals, and social gatherings, using their influence to maintain order and cohesion in the town. They held the social fabric together, not just through their economic work, but through their ability to lead and nurture the community in ways that were both subtle and powerful. Yet, as with so many other aspects of medieval life, the contributions of women in the public sphere were often overlooked or dismissed. The chroniclers of the time, often men, focused on the exploits of male leaders and warriors, while the work of women in the marketplace and the local community was relegated to the background. This erasure of women's roles in the public sphere has led to a distorted view of medieval society, where the contributions of half the population are hidden from view. As we continue to uncover the forgotten histories of women in the medieval period, we begin to see a new, fuller picture of their impact on society. These women were not mere bystanders, they were essential to the economic and social life of their communities. They shaped the markets, influenced local politics, and maintained the social order through their work and leadership. Their power, though often unseen and unrecognized, was integral to the survival and prosperity of their towns. In the next chapter, we will see how the roles of women in the community extended beyond the market and town square, influencing larger societal structures and political dynamics. The impact of these women, hidden from the historical record for so long, offers a new perspective on the medieval world, one where women were not just passive participants, but active forces in shaping the course of history. In the history of medieval Europe, the image of women's labour has often been confined to the home cooking, cleaning, and child-rearing. But what if this image was just a surface-level illusion? What if, beneath the quiet domesticity, women were the true engine behind the medieval economy, working behind the scenes to power the industries that shaped society? From textile production to agriculture, women were integral to medieval industry, often working alongside men in sectors we traditionally associate with male dominance. These women's labour was not only vital to the survival of their families, but also the backbone of the broader economy. The hidden contributions of medieval women were, in many ways, the foundation of everything that held the medieval world together. Medieval industry was vast and varied, spanning everything from agriculture to craftsmanship, from the production of textiles to the brewing of beer. While men might have been the public face of many of these industries, it was women who were the silent workforce, ensuring that these industries functioned smoothly. In rural areas, women worked alongside men in the fields, planting and harvesting crops, maintaining livestock, and managing the agricultural processes that supported entire communities. The idea that women were confined to the home or simply worked in the background while men took the lead is not just misleading, it overlooks the essential role women played in these industries. Take, for example, the textile industry, which was one of the largest industries in medieval Europe. Women were crucial to the production of textiles, from spinning the wool to weaving the cloth that clothed entire populations. Women worked in the home, spinning and weaving by hand, often in small workshops or even alongside their families. In some areas, entire villages were known for their textile production, and it was often women who ran these workshops, controlling the production and trade of the goods. These women were not just labourers, they were integral to the success of the local and regional textile markets, providing the raw materials that were traded far and wide. The contribution of women in this industry was so significant that they essentially determined the flow of goods, shaping the economic structure of entire regions. In addition to the textile industry, women were deeply involved in the agricultural sector. While the ploughing of fields and the management of large estates might have been tasks reserved for men, women were responsible for many of the daily tasks that kept the agricultural system running. They managed gardens, tended to small animals, and processed the food that families consumed, from grinding grain to preserving vegetables. This work was not just for personal survival, it had economic value. Women's agricultural labour supported the broader market system, with many women selling produce, dairy products, and preserves at local markets. Their labour provided a crucial foundation for local economies, often bridging the gap between the rural agricultural world and the urban markets that relied on these goods. Women were also active participants in the running of workshops and craft industries. In urban centres, women played a key role in industries such as brewing, pottery making, and leatherworking. Brewing, in particular, was a female-dominated industry. Women were responsible for brewing beer and ale, which were staples of medieval life, consumed daily by people of all ages. Brewing was often done in the home, with women overseeing the production and sale of beer, which was then traded in local markets or served in inns and taverns. This industry, essential to medieval society, would not have thrived without the hard work of women. In fact, some records indicate that women in certain regions had exclusive rights to brew and sell beer, cementing their vital role in both the production and distribution of one of the most important commodities of the time. In many ways, the labour of women in these industries was crucial to the functioning of medieval towns and villages. Women's contributions were often essential, yet they were frequently overlooked in historical records. Men were more likely to be recognised as the leaders of guilds or the heads of workshops, but women were often the ones who kept these operations running on a day-to-day basis. They were the ones who ensured that production continued, that goods were sold, and that local economies thrived. Without their work, medieval society would have faced significant shortages, and many industries would have ground to a halt. Yet, despite the importance of their contributions, the work of women in these industries has been largely forgotten. Chroniclers of the time, who were mostly men, rarely acknowledged the economic contributions of women. They focused instead on the military exploits of kings, the political machinations of nobles, and the achievements of men in public life. Women, particularly those working in industry and commerce, were often left out of these historical accounts. As a result, their labour, which was vital to the functioning of medieval society, has been largely erased from the historical record. The erasure of women's contributions is not just a historical oversight, it is a reflection of the patriarchal systems that dominated medieval society. The historical record was shaped by the interests of those in power, and those in power were almost exclusively men. Women's work was undervalued and often invisible, despite its central role in maintaining the economy and the social structure. This pattern of erasure has continued for centuries, leading to a widespread misunderstanding of the role women played in shaping society. As we look back on the medieval period, it becomes clear that women were not just passive participants in the economy, they were essential to its success. Their labour, often hidden from view, was the engine that drove the industries, markets, and communities that formed the backbone of medieval society. These women were not just homebound workers, they were integral to the larger economic and social systems that sustained the medieval world. The more we uncover about their roles, the more we can begin to understand how medieval society functioned and how the contributions of women were critical to its success. This rediscovery of women's hidden labour and contributions in medieval industry is not only important for understanding the past, it has profound implications for how we view women's roles in the modern world. As we continue to examine the legacy of these forgotten women, we begin to see how their influence, once erased from history, can help us rethink modern ideas of gender, work, and power. As we move into the next chapter, we will explore how the erasure of these women's contributions shaped the societal structures of the medieval world, and how these structures continue to influence the way we view women's labour today. What if everything we thought we knew about medieval history was incomplete? For centuries, the history of medieval women was relegated to the shadows, their roles dismissed or outright erased from the records. Yet, a quiet revolution is unfolding in the world of history and archaeology, one that is slowly but surely reclaiming these lost voices and rewriting our understanding of the past. Scholars, historians, and archaeologists are increasingly turning their attention to the hidden histories of women, uncovering fragments of their lives that had long been overlooked or buried under layers of time. These rediscovered histories are not just academic pursuits, they are reshaping our entire understanding of medieval society. The effort to recover these hidden roles is a meticulous and often challenging process. Medieval women were largely excluded from official records. History, after all, was written by men. The written word of the time, often recorded by clergy or chroniclers, focused primarily on the exploits of kings, knights, and religious leaders. Women's lives were rarely documented, and when they were, their roles were minimized or misrepresented. The task of modern historians is, therefore, to piece together a fragmented narrative from the sparse and often biased records that survive. It's a process that involves not only reading between the lines of these texts, but also looking beyond them, at artifacts, oral traditions, and other non-written sources that provide clues to women's hidden lives. Archaeology has played a crucial role in this rediscovery. Excavations of medieval sites have uncovered objects that hint at the far-reaching influence of women in medieval society. Jewelry, household items, tools for textile production, and even religious artifacts associated with women have surfaced, offering tangible evidence of their roles in both the domestic and public spheres. These discoveries tell us that women were far more active in medieval industry, commerce, and religion than history has previously suggested. For example, the unearthing of women's personal items from burial sites, such as those found in the graves of Anglo-Saxon women, reveals a wealth of information about their status, occupation, and social roles, insights that have often been overlooked in written history. In addition to archaeological evidence, historians have begun to analyze neglected historical documents, letters, diaries, and manuscripts written by or about women that were once dismissed as insignificant. These documents, often found in archives or libraries, are now being re-evaluated. Female scholars, in particular, have been instrumental in uncovering these voices. Pioneering historians like Christine de Pizan in the 14th century, who wrote about the roles of women in society, and modern historians like Caroline Larrington and Judith M. Bennett have brought new attention to these often overlooked sources. They have argued that by examining the ways women have been excluded from history, we can gain a clearer understanding of the power structures that shaped medieval society. Another important tool in uncovering the hidden roles of women is the study of oral traditions. In a time when much of the population was illiterate, oral storytelling was a critical means of passing down knowledge and history. Women, who were often the primary storytellers in families and communities, carried with them a wealth of cultural knowledge that went untold in the written record. Folklore, legends, and songs, many of which have survived through generations, carry traces of women's lives, their struggles, and their roles in shaping the social and economic world around them. By studying these oral traditions, historians are uncovering insights into the everyday lives of medieval women, revealing how they influenced society from within the home and beyond. Despite the advancements in this field, however, there are still significant challenges in piecing together these histories. Much of the evidence is fragmentary or indirect, and many records have been lost or destroyed over the centuries. The surviving documents are often incomplete, biased, or written with the intent of minimizing women's roles. This leaves modern scholars with a difficult task, one that requires both creativity and skepticism. Researchers must work with partial records, reinterpret existing sources, and sometimes even reframe the way they approach historical inquiry itself. Moreover, there's the issue of the prevailing cultural attitudes toward women in medieval times, which were often deeply misogynistic. This societal bias is reflected not only in the omission of women from historical texts, but in the way the stories that do exist have been shaped. Many of the women who did make it into the historical record were portrayed in limited, stereotypical roles, such as saints, wives, or passive figures in the shadow of powerful men. These depictions often mask the real complexity of women's lives and contributions. Still, despite these obstacles, modern historians are making incredible strides in uncovering these hidden histories. As more and more scholars turn their attention to the contributions of women, a fuller, richer picture of medieval life is emerging. The recovery of these forgotten women's stories is not just an academic exercise, it is a powerful reassertion of the role women played in shaping history, even when their contributions were hidden from view. This rediscovery is not without real-world implications. By unearthing these forgotten stories, modern scholars are challenging the historical narrative that has long excluded women. They are rewriting the past, giving us a more complete and accurate understanding of how society functioned in the medieval period. In turn, This process has far-reaching consequences for how we view gender and power today. Understanding the pivotal roles women played in medieval society can alter the way we perceive women's contributions in our own time, reshaping our ideas of leadership, influence, and authority. The study of women's history, while still in its infancy, promises to change the way we understand the past. These forgotten histories are not only valuable for what they tell us about the medieval world, they are equally important for what they teach us about how history is written, remembered, and reshaped over time. As we continue to uncover the lost roles of medieval women, we are not only recovering the past but also contributing to a more inclusive and accurate understanding of history itself. As we continue our exploration of these forgotten roles, we'll begin to see how the rediscovery of women's contributions in medieval society isn't just about reclaiming their place in history. It's about reshaping the way we view power, identity, and culture today. In the next section, we will delve into the lasting impact of these rediscovered histories on modern culture, particularly in terms of gender perception and the reclaiming of women's rightful place in history. What if uncovering the lives of medieval women could change the way we see power and gender today? The past is rewriting our future, slowly but surely, as historians and scholars uncover the hidden roles that women played in medieval society. These rediscovered histories are not just fascinating glimpses into the past, they are having a profound impact on our present-day understanding of gender, power, and identity. By shedding light on the essential, often overlooked contributions of women in the medieval world, we are beginning to challenge long-standing stereotypes and rethink what it means to be powerful, influential, or even behind the scenes. For centuries, the traditional narrative of history has been one where men are seen as the primary drivers of power and change. Kings, warriors, and conquerors dominate the history books, while the contributions of women are either ignored or relegated to the margins. Yet, as scholars uncover the hidden lives of women who played pivotal roles in politics, religion, trade, and even warfare, they are dismantling this narrow definition of power. The rediscovery of these women's stories is prompting us to rethink the very nature of influence and authority and how both are deeply tied to gender. One of the most significant cultural impacts of rediscovering medieval women's roles is the challenge it poses to long-standing gender stereotypes. For much of history, women were depicted as passive figures, either confined to the home or existing as the supporting characters in the stories of men. The idea that women could hold power, act as political leaders, or shape the course of history was largely absent from mainstream historical narratives. Yet, as we learn about the powerful queens, strategists, warriors, and businesswomen of the medieval period, we begin to realize that women's roles were far more active, complex, and influential than we ever thought. The stories of these women are reshaping our ideas of what power looks like. Power doesn't always manifest in the loud, visible forms that we often associate with it. Sometimes it is wielded quietly, behind the scenes, through economic control, political manipulation, or spiritual influence. These women were not simply passive figures, they were active participants in the events that shaped their world. The cultural shift sparked by these revelations has been felt in modern feminist movements, which continue to challenge the historical narrative and fight for gender equality. The rediscovery of women's contributions to medieval society is part of a larger movement to reclaim the histories of women that have been lost or distorted over time. In uncovering the stories of these women, we are not only correcting historical omissions but also empowering contemporary movements that demand women's voices be heard and valued equally in all spheres of life. The new visibility of these women challenges outdated notions of female passivity, replacing them with role models whose actions and contributions have shaped history in profound ways. This re-emergence of forgotten histories is also influencing how we think about power today. Modern society has often idealized certain forms of power, political, military, financial. But the rediscovery of women's roles in the past shows us that power can take many forms. Women in medieval times, whether as leaders in the court, healers in the home, or businesswomen in the market, exercised power in ways that were often hidden from the dominant historical record. These women worked behind the scenes to shape the course of events, and their influence extended far beyond the private sphere. Recognizing the many forms of power that women held in the past encourages us to broaden our definitions of power in the present, understanding that power isn't just about titles or positions, but about the ability to shape society in meaningful ways. Popular culture has already begun to incorporate these rediscovered roles, with movies, TV shows, and literature increasingly bringing medieval women's stories into the spotlight. Shows like The Last Kingdom and Vikings have begun to feature powerful female characters who are not just the wives or daughters of kings, but leaders in their own right, involved in political and military strategy. Books and documentaries that explore the lives of historical figures like Eleanor of Aquitaine, Joan of Arc, and Hildegard of Bingen are making their way into mainstream culture, inspiring a new generation of people to reconsider the role of women in shaping history. These portrayals are not just fictionalized retellings, they are based on the real, often hidden histories of women who were active agents in their time. Through the lens of contemporary media, we are seeing these forgotten histories brought to life, encouraging us to question the traditional historical narrative and expand our understanding of women's roles in society. These rediscovered roles are also influencing our cultural conversations about gender and leadership. As we re-examine medieval women's contributions, we are forced to confront how far we've come and how far we still have to go in terms of gender equality. If women were able to wield significant influence and power in the medieval world, what barriers are still preventing women from doing so today? The rediscovery of medieval women's histories challenges us to look at the structural inequalities that still persist, not just in our political systems, but in our cultural assumptions about gender. These new perspectives invite us to reconsider the nature of leadership, influence, and authority in today's world. This cultural shift has real-world implications, encouraging society to see women not just as passive participants, but as active, powerful agents of change. As we begin to understand how women have shaped history both through overt acts of leadership and through their quiet, behind-the-scenes influence, we start to see how these historical narratives can inform modern struggles for equality. Just as medieval women defied social and political norms to shape their world, contemporary women continue to challenge the norms that seek to limit their roles in society. As we continue to explore these rediscovered histories, we will see how the new understanding of women's roles in the medieval world also calls us to reconsider the way history itself has been shaped. The next chapter will delve into how these discoveries are not just about recovering lost stories, they are about historical revisionism, challenging the ways in which we've come to understand power, gender, and society. The journey to reclaim these forgotten histories is just beginning, and its effects will ripple through our culture, encouraging us to see the past and the present in an entirely new light. What if the history we've been taught is incomplete? What if the very foundations of our understanding of the past are built on narratives that intentionally or unintentionally omit entire chapters of history? The battle to rewrite history is on, and medieval women are at the heart of it. For centuries, the contributions of women were minimized, ignored, or deliberately erased from the historical record. Now, historians, activists, and scholars are fighting to uncover the full scope of history, reclaiming the lives and actions of these often overlooked figures. Their work is not only transforming textbooks and media portrayals, but reshaping the cultural narratives that influence how we understand the past and, by extension, the present. Historical revisionism, the process of reinterpreting and revising established historical narratives, is a powerful tool in reshaping our collective understanding of the past. For too long, mainstream history has been told through a lens that favors male perspectives, particularly those of kings, warriors, and powerful political leaders. In the process, women's contributions were either relegated to the background or entirely erased. Whether due to cultural biases, institutional oversight, or deliberate exclusion, women's roles in shaping history were minimized. This gap in the historical narrative not only distorts our understanding of the past, but also perpetuates gender inequality by reinforcing the idea that women's contributions are less important. One of the most significant aspects of historical revisionism today is the work of reclaiming women's roles, both in the public and private spheres. The focus is on uncovering stories of women who were political leaders, warriors, healers, businesswomen, and cultural influencers figures, whose impact on medieval society has been deliberately ignored or obscured. Feminist scholars and historians have been instrumental in this process, pushing for a more inclusive and accurate portrayal of history. Through the study of archival materials, artifacts, and oral traditions, they are uncovering the lost histories of women who once wielded significant power. Their work challenges the traditional view of women as passive figures and instead highlights their contributions to society in profound and often unexpected ways. However, the battle for true representation is not without its controversies. Many traditional scholars resist the idea of revising well-established historical narratives, arguing that the historical record is already complete or accurate as it stands. These historians claim that the revisionist approach risks distorting history by focusing too much on previously overlooked figures or giving undue attention to marginalized groups. While some of these concerns stem from legitimate debates over methodology and interpretation, others reflect an underlying resistance to changing the established canon. For decades, the historical narrative has been largely shaped by male-dominated institutions, academia, government, and media, and many of these institutions have been slow to embrace the idea of rewriting history to include the experiences and contributions of women. Despite the challenges, the revisionist movement is gaining momentum. Modern history books, documentaries, and media portrayals are increasingly incorporating the stories of women in medieval society, revealing the crucial roles they played in everything from politics to commerce to the arts. Feminist scholars and activists are working tirelessly to ensure that women's voices are heard and that their stories are included in the historical narrative. Their work has already led to the re-evaluation of well-known historical figures, such as Joan of Arc and Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose stories have been told through a more nuanced and accurate lens. These revised portrayals not only correct historical omissions, but also offer a new perspective on the complex roles women played in shaping the course of history. One of the most important aspects of this revisionist work is its impact on modern culture. By uncovering these hidden histories, scholars are challenging traditional gender norms and reshaping how we think about power and authority. The stories of medieval women reveal that women were not just passive observers of history, but active participants who wielded influence in their communities, courts, and even battlefields. This revelation has profound implications for how we view women today, especially in terms of leadership and agency. The inclusion of women in the historical narrative shows that leadership, power, and influence are not confined to men. Women, too, have the ability to shape the world around them, even in societies that sought to suppress their voices. Moreover, the resurgence of these women's histories is becoming a critical tool in empowering women today. By reclaiming these forgotten narratives, modern women can find role models who defied the odds and shaped their societies in ways that were once thought to be impossible. These rediscovered histories show that women have always had the power to make a difference, even when society tried to limit their influence. This empowerment is not just theoretical, it's a call to action for women today to recognize their own potential, to lead, innovate, and transform the world. The process of revising history is not just about uncovering the past. It's about challenging the very structures that have shaped our cultural understanding of gender and power. As these revisionist histories become more mainstream, they are influencing how we view women in all areas of life: politics, business, culture, and beyond. The more we uncover about women's roles in medieval society, the more we realize that the limitations placed on women in the past were not due to their abilities, but to the social structures that sought to constrain them. By reclaiming these women's contributions, we are not only rewriting history, we are reshaping how we think about women's potential today. As we move into the next chapter, we will explore specific figures from medieval history whose legacies have been hidden or misrepresented. These powerful women, whose stories have remained largely unspoken, played critical roles in shaping the medieval world. By examining their legacies, we will gain a deeper understanding of how their influence extended far beyond their lifetimes, and how their forgotten stories continue to resonate today. What if the most powerful queens in medieval history were erased from the record? The stories of these women, queens, warriors, diplomats, and political strategists, have often been overlooked or misrepresented, despite their profound influence on the course of history. Figures like Queen Matilda of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine were not just consorts to kings, but rulers in their own right, shaping the political landscape of their time. Yet, their legacies have largely been relegated to the background, overshadowed by their male counterparts. The truth is, these women were not merely footnotes in history. They were forces to be reckoned with, wielding power, influence, and intelligence in ways that have often been minimized or forgotten. Today, as historians re-examine the past, these lost royal figures are finally beginning to emerge from the shadows. Queen Matilda of England, the daughter of King Henry I, is one such figure whose remarkable life and legacy have been largely overlooked. Matilda's claim to the English throne was contested after her father's death, leading to the bitter civil war known as the Anarchy. Despite being the legitimate heir, Matilda faced fierce opposition from her cousin, Stephen of Blois, who seized the throne. Throughout the conflict, Matilda demonstrated not only her political savvy, but her military capabilities as well. She led armies, managed her supporters, and fought for her rightful claim with determination and strategy. However, her reign was undermined by the chroniclers of her time, who often portrayed her as an outsider, too unfeminine to rule. The historical record was shaped to minimize her accomplishments, and her story was overshadowed by the men involved in the conflict. It is only now, with the rise of feminist historiography and a more critical approach to the past, that we are beginning to understand the true scope of her influence, not just as a queen, but as a powerful political leader in her own right. Then there is Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose legacy is as monumental as it is misunderstood. Eleanor was one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in medieval Europe, holding control over vast territories in France and later England. Her marriage to King Louis VII of France, and later to King Henry II of England, made her one of the most influential queens of her time, yet her contributions to politics and diplomacy have often been overshadowed by the actions of her husbands. Eleanor played a crucial role in the political and military decisions of both her marriages. She accompanied her first husband on the Second Crusade and was a political force in her own right, known for her strong-willed personality and leadership. After her marriage to Henry II, she helped govern the Angevin Empire, managing affairs of state, arranging key alliances, and influencing the course of English history. Eleanor was also deeply involved in the rebellion against Henry's rule, supporting her sons in their bid for power. Despite her political and military contributions, Eleanor's role has often been framed through the lens of her relationships with men, her husbands and sons, rather than as a leader in her own right. Eleanor's story is a prime example of how royal women's power has been undermined in the historical record. Chroniclers of the time tended to focus on her marriages and familial relations, often reducing her to the role of a passive queen consort or an ambitious mother. Her political acumen and independence, which were crucial to the success of her reigns, have often been downplayed or ignored. It is only in recent decades that historians have started to reassess Eleanor's true influence. Today, Eleanor is recognized not just as a queen, but as a woman who skillfully navigated the complex political dynamics of medieval Europe and helped shape the course of history through her decisions. The lives of Matilda and Eleanor demonstrate that women in medieval royalty were not passive figures waiting in the wings of history. They were powerful political players, capable of leading armies, managing realms, and influencing the decisions that shaped the medieval world. Their stories challenged the traditional narrative of medieval society, where men are portrayed as the sole drivers of power and change. These queens were not simply consorts to powerful kings. They were political leaders in their own right, shaping the future of their kingdoms, defending their territories, and navigating treacherous political landscapes. Their struggles and successes deserve to be acknowledged, not as exceptions to the rule, but as integral parts of the history of the medieval world. Yet, despite their significant roles, the legacies of these queens have been marginalized, their contributions obscured by a historical record that has often been more concerned with the achievements of their male counterparts. The stories of these powerful women were not just neglected, they were actively erased, their influence reduced or ignored in favor of male-dominated narratives. This erasure is a result of both the patriarchal structures of medieval society and the biases of historians who wrote the history of the time. It's only now, through the lens of modern scholarship and historical revisionism, that we are starting to recognize the full extent of their power. The rediscovery of these queens' roles in history is part of a larger movement to uncover the stories of women whose contributions have been hidden or overlooked. As we re-examine the past, we begin to see how these women were not exceptions, but vital figures in the complex political, social, and cultural fabric of medieval society. By reclaiming their stories, we are not just correcting historical omissions, we are reshaping our understanding of what it means to be a leader, a ruler, and a force for change. This section on royal women will smoothly transition into the next, focusing on the stories of women who, though not of royal blood, wielded significant influence in other ways. These women, whose voices were often silenced by history, helped shape the course of events just as much as their royal counterparts. Whether through their involvement in trade, diplomacy, or social reform, their contributions were integral to the functioning of medieval society. By uncovering these hidden voices, we continue to challenge the traditional historical narrative and bring to light the forgotten legacies of powerful women. Who were the women who shaped history from behind the curtains of power? Their stories have been erased, but they had more influence than we think. In medieval courts, power was not always wielded by the kings and knights who dominated the historical narrative. Behind the scenes, there were women, wives, mothers, sisters, and daughters whose covert influence shaped the course of kingdoms, wars, and political alliances. These women were often the unseen architects of political change, guiding the actions of kings, influencing policy, and managing the intricate webs of court politics. Though their roles were frequently minimized or erased by male chroniclers, these women played an indispensable role in the functioning of medieval society. Take, for example, Margaret of Anjou, the wife of King Henry VI of England. Margaret was a central figure in the Wars of the Roses, a series of dynastic conflicts that tore England apart in the 15th century. While the focus of the wars has often been placed on the rival factions, the House of Lancaster and the House of York, the political manoeuvres of Margaret, a woman, were critical to the conflict's outcome. As Queen Consort, Margaret was fiercely protective of her husband's throne and her son's future, using her position to rally support for the Lancastrian cause. She secured alliances, negotiated with foreign powers, and even took to the battlefield to lead her troops. Her political acumen and strategic mind were pivotal in sustaining the Lancastrian resistance, yet her role has often been overshadowed by the actions of the men in her life. Male chroniclers minimized her contributions, portraying her as a mere pawn in a male-dominated struggle, rather than as a determined and capable leader in her own right. Margaret's story is just one example of the many women who operated behind the throne, using their influence to shape the course of history, often at great personal risk. These women were not only Queen's consort but also mothers, sisters, and daughters who understood the political realities of their time and leveraged their positions to protect their families and secure their dynasties. Women like Eleanor of Castile, wife of Edward I of England, and Isabella of France, who became the Queen Consort of Edward II, also wielded significant power, even though their roles were often obscured in historical records. Eleanor, for instance, played a vital role in the management of her husband's extensive estates and participated in diplomatic missions on his behalf. Isabella, on the other hand, was instrumental in the overthrow of her husband, Edward II, in one of the most dramatic coups of medieval England, acting as a political force in her own right. These women were often involved in the day-to-day affairs of court life, from arranging political marriages to mediating disputes, and they frequently had the ear of powerful men. While they may not have been rulers in the traditional sense, their influence was felt far beyond the confines of the private sphere. Their roles as political brokers were crucial to the functioning of their kingdoms, and they wielded their power with a subtlety and intelligence that was often underestimated or ignored by male contemporaries. This covert power was not always recognized in its time, but it was essential in maintaining stability and shaping the political landscape. However, the influence of these women was often fraught with risk. Operating behind the throne meant that their actions were subject to the whims of powerful men, and the politics of medieval courts were notoriously dangerous. Betrayal, exile, or even death were constant threats. Margaret of Anjou, for example, was forced into a precarious position during the latter stages of the Wars of the Roses when the Lancastrian cause faltered. Her political and military involvement led to her eventual capture and imprisonment, but her legacy remains one of tenacity and strategic brilliance. Similarly, Isabella of France's role in the deposition of her husband was not without peril, as it ultimately led to her estrangement from her son, the new king, and her fall from favour. The stories of these women, though often sidelined in traditional historical accounts, are now being reconsidered through the lens of feminist historiography. Modern scholars are beginning to unearth the layers of influence these women held and reassess their role in shaping political history. By challenging the patriarchal structures that dominated historical writing, these scholars are recovering the hidden histories of women who were once relegated to the margins of political power. As we begin to acknowledge the extent of their influence, we come to see that these women were not simply figures of nobility, they were powerful agents of change who shaped the political and cultural landscapes of their time. While these women operated behind the scenes, their influence was far from invisible. They crafted alliances, managed resources, and advised kings on matters of state. The actions they took often had far-reaching consequences, influencing the fates of entire dynasties and shaping the course of wars. Their political maneuvering was essential to the stability of their kingdoms, and without their strategic intelligence, the events of the medieval world may have unfolded quite differently. This section on women behind the throne sets the stage for our next exploration of the untold contributions of women to religious and spiritual life. While these women were powerful political figures in the courts, their influence did not stop there. Their roles extended into the sacred realms, where they also wielded power in ways that have often been overlooked. The stories of their spiritual leadership and influence in religious matters reveal another layer of the hidden power women held in medieval society. As we continue to peel back the layers of their lives, we uncover how these women used their influence not only to shape politics, but also to shape the very spiritual fabric of their worlds. What if the most influential spiritual leaders in medieval history were women, but their stories were hidden by the church itself? The spiritual and intellectual landscape of medieval Europe was deeply shaped by powerful women whose contributions have been largely obscured or erased by the patriarchal structures of the time. While the church traditionally portrayed women in restrictive roles, women were, in fact, integral to the religious and spiritual life of the medieval world. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen, who was not only a visionary but also a polymath, exemplify the profound influence that women held within religious communities, despite the gendered limitations imposed by the church. These women were more than just nuns or abbesses. They were spiritual leaders, intellectual pioneers, and agents of change, whose contributions have shaped religious and intellectual traditions in ways we are only beginning to fully understand. Hildegard of Bingen is perhaps one of the most well-known and influential women of the medieval period, but her story remains only partially recognized in mainstream historical accounts. Hildegard, a Benedictine abbess, mystic, and polymath, was a visionary whose intellectual and spiritual influence extended well beyond the walls of her convent. She composed music, wrote theological works, and even created a system of medicine that blended spiritual insights with practical knowledge. Hildegard's visions, which she experienced throughout her life, were deeply religious in nature, and she was considered by many to be divinely inspired. These visions were not only spiritual, but also included intricate knowledge of the natural world, which she recorded in her writings. Her books, particularly Scivia's Know the Ways, were revolutionary in their time, combining theological concepts with philosophy, science, and music. Despite the limitations placed on women in the medieval church, Hildegard's spiritual authority was so great that she was consulted by popes, emperors, and other influential figures. Yet, Hildegard's influence went beyond her personal achievements. As the head of a convent, she held a position of power and respect within the church. Her leadership extended to the spiritual and intellectual life of her community, where she was known for her wisdom and counsel. She shaped not only the religious practices of her convent, but also played a significant role in the broader religious and intellectual movements of her time. However, her legacy was not without resistance. The church, which at the time was dominated by men, viewed her visions with skepticism and at times attempted to suppress her influence. But Hildegard's tenacity and the undeniable power of her ideas allowed her to carve out a significant space for herself in both religious and intellectual history. Hildegard was not an anomaly, though. Many other women in the medieval period held influential roles within religious communities, even though their stories have often been ignored or minimized. Nuns and abbesses, though often relegated to the convent, played central roles in maintaining the religious and intellectual traditions of their time. Convents were places where women could not only pursue spiritual life, but also engage in education, artistic creation, and scientific inquiry. These religious women were often the primary intellectuals of their communities, preserving and transmitting knowledge in an era when education was mostly the domain of men. In many ways, convents acted as intellectual centers, where women were the custodians of sacred texts, theological debates, and scientific discovery. Abbesses, in particular, wielded significant power within their religious communities. As the heads of convents, they were responsible for the spiritual and material well-being of their convents, overseeing the education and daily lives of their fellow nuns. Some abbesses, such as Hilda of Whitby and Teresa of Avila, were also highly respected for their ability to shape the spiritual direction of the church. Hilda, for example, presided over the famous Synod of Whitby in 664, where the future of Christianity in England was decided, and her influence on the religious landscape was profound. Teresa of Avila, a Spanish Carmelite reformer in the 16th century, is another example of a woman who shaped the spiritual landscape, advocating for deep reform within the church and being recognized as one of the greatest mystics in history. Women also had significant influence in other religious domains, such as mysticism and lay spirituality. Many women became known for their deep, personal spiritual experiences, often described as mystical or visionary. These women, though not always officially recognized by the Church, played key roles in shaping the spiritual and religious practices of their time. Their mysticism provided a path for women to engage with the divine in ways that were not always confined to the traditional, male-dominated structures of the Church. Women like Mechthild of Magdeburg and Julian of Norwich were pioneers of mystical theology, offering new perspectives on the relationship between the soul and God. Their writings, though often marginalized, have been rediscovered in recent years as sources of profound theological and spiritual insight. The challenge of uncovering the religious contributions of these women is compounded by the historical narratives written by male chroniclers, who often minimized or completely ignored women's spiritual leadership. The patriarchal structure of the Church itself was often reluctant to acknowledge the spiritual authority of women, as it would have undermined the gendered power structures in place. The concept of women as spiritual leaders was seen as problematic in a religion that was institutionally dominated by men, and as a result, many women's roles as religious leaders were either erased or downplayed in official church documents and histories. Today, as modern scholars and feminists reclaim these lost voices, we are beginning to see a new understanding of medieval spirituality, one that acknowledges the immense contributions of women to the development of religious thought, spiritual practice, and intellectual inquiry. By re-examining the lives of women like Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich, and Mechthild of Magdeburg, we begin to see how women were not only integral to the religious life of their communities, but were also pioneers of thought, philosophy, and spirituality. The work of these women is not just important for understanding the medieval period, but for reshaping our understanding of spirituality and leadership today. This rediscovery of the spiritual and intellectual power of medieval women leads us into the next chapter, where we will explore how these women's legacies continue to influence modern society. From shaping contemporary spiritual practices to providing a model for women's leadership, their contributions remain vital in today's world. As we continue to uncover the hidden histories of these women, we recognize that their influence extends far beyond their own time, and that their contributions to both religious and secular life are essential to our understanding of history and culture. What if the whispers of medieval women's influence are still echoing through modern society? Their legacies may have been hidden for centuries, obscured by the dominant narratives of their time, but they are far from forgotten. The cultural, intellectual, and spiritual contributions of medieval women have subtly shaped many aspects of contemporary life, and as their stories resurface in modern culture, we begin to see how their influence continues to resonate. From literature to medicine, politics to religion, the legacy of these women is woven into the fabric of modern society in ways we are only beginning to understand. While many of these women's names may have been lost to history, their impact is far-reaching. For example, the writings and teachings of visionary figures like Hildegard of Bingen have not only been rediscovered, but have inspired new generations of thinkers, artists, and spiritual leaders. Hildegard's contributions to medieval medicine, theology, and music continue to influence contemporary thought. Her medical writings, which combine natural remedies with spiritual insights, laid the groundwork for a holistic approach to health that still resonates today in alternative medicine. Her theological works, too, have inspired modern spiritual movements, particularly those focused on the integration of body, mind, and spirit. The very notion of a woman occupying such a multifaceted role in medieval society, blending spirituality with intellectual pursuits, continues to challenge traditional ideas about women's capacities in contemporary culture. Similarly, the influence of medieval women in literature and intellectual life can be seen in the resurgence of interest in figures like Christine de Pizan, a 14th century French writer and philosopher. Christine is often considered one of the earliest feminists, and her works, particularly the Book of the City of Ladies, have been rediscovered by modern scholars as a powerful critique of the gender inequalities of her time. Through her writing, Christine constructed a vision of a society where women were empowered, celebrated for their intellect, and given the opportunity to contribute to society in meaningful ways. Her ideas were revolutionary in her time, and their revival in the modern era speaks to the lasting resonance of her message about women's autonomy and intellectual equality. In the realm of medicine, women's contributions during the medieval period have had a lasting impact, especially as modern scholars reassess the role of women as healers and caregivers. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen, but also lesser-known women such as Trotula of Salerno, who contributed to medical texts in the 11th century, laid the foundations for early medical knowledge and women's involvement in healthcare. These women worked within a male-dominated field, but were instrumental in creating medical practices that blended physical and spiritual healing, many of which persisted through the centuries. Today, the rise of integrative medicine, which combines conventional healthcare with alternative treatments, can trace its roots back to these medieval women, whose understanding of the interconnectedness of body and spirit was ahead of their time. Women in the medieval world were also pivotal in shaping the political landscape of their societies, even when their political power was often hidden or overlooked. While medieval queens and noble women like Eleanor of Aquitaine and Margaret of Anjou were directly involved in the political affairs of their time, other women exercised influence in more subtle ways, through strategic marriages, patronage of the arts, and involvement in local governance. These women shaped the political and social structures that still affect us today. Their efforts to navigate and influence male-dominated power structures are echoed in modern political movements, particularly those advocating for gender equality and women's participation in politics. The resurgence of interest in medieval women is not just confined to academic circles. Popular culture has begun to incorporate the untold stories of these women, bringing their legacies to a broader audience. Films, books, and TV series are increasingly turning to medieval women's stories as a source of inspiration. Characters based on historical figures like Joan of Arc, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and Marjorie Kempe are becoming central to narratives that explore themes of power, resistance, and the role of women in shaping history. These portrayals are helping to challenge the traditional historical canon, highlighting the ways in which women, though often sidelined, played pivotal roles in the events that shaped their worlds. One of the most notable shifts in modern culture is how these rediscovered legacies are being woven into contemporary feminist movements. The resurgence of medieval women's stories has become a powerful tool for feminist scholars, activists, and cultural critics who are working to challenge long-standing gender norms and perceptions of power. The rediscovery of figures like Christine de Pizan and Hildegard of Bingen provides a model for contemporary women seeking to assert their intellectual, spiritual, and political influence. These women's experiences show that power is not always overt or visible, but can be exerted through intellectual contributions, spiritual leadership, and strategic action behind the scenes. The examination of these women's legacies also speaks to the broader fight for gender equality in today's world. By recovering the histories of women who shaped medieval society, we are reminded of the resilience and creativity of women throughout history who found ways to navigate oppressive systems and still leave their mark. Their stories encourage modern women to see themselves as part of a long tradition of women who have made significant contributions to society, even when those contributions were unacknowledged or erased. The lasting influence of these hidden medieval women is not just an academic interest. It is a living, breathing force that continues to shape our cultural narratives today. As we recover these lost stories, we are not simply rewriting history. We are transforming the way we understand gender, power, and influence in modern society. The legacies of these women are shaping new generations of thinkers, leaders, and activists, encouraging a re-evaluation of what is possible for women in all spheres of life. As we transition into the next chapter, we will further explore the ongoing cultural impact of these women's legacies and the ways in which their stories are continuing to inspire modern movements, particularly in the realm of gender equality. By revisiting their lives and contributions, we are not only reclaiming lost histories, but redefining what it means to hold power, to influence change, and to leave a lasting legacy. The echoes of these medieval women's lives reverberate through our modern world, inviting us to reconsider how history is written and whose voices are included in that narrative. How did the feminist movement bring medieval women's erased histories back into the light? The battle for truth in history has only just begun. For centuries, the contributions of women in medieval society were not only marginalized, but systematically erased from the historical record. The narrative of history, largely written by men, relegated women to secondary roles, often portraying them as passive figures in the shadow of their male counterparts. It was only through the rise of feminist movements, particularly in the 20th and 21st centuries, that the hidden stories of these women began to resurface. By challenging traditional historical narratives, feminists have not only uncovered the erased histories of medieval women, but have also changed the way we understand gender, power, and agency in the past. Feminist scholars were among the first to question the long-held assumptions about women's roles in history, and their work has been central to the rediscovery of medieval women's lives. They recognized that the historical record, as it had been constructed, was incomplete, overwhelmingly shaped by male perspectives. It largely ignored or downplayed the contributions of women. Feminists argued that by studying women's roles in medieval society, we could gain a more nuanced and complete understanding of the past. Rather than viewing medieval women through the narrow lens of traditional gender roles, they sought to highlight how these women actively shaped their societies, whether in politics, religion, or intellectual life. The feminist movement also played a crucial role in challenging the idea that medieval women were confined to the domestic sphere. Feminist historians recognized that the church and societal structures had a vested interest in minimizing the roles women played in public life, and that this cultural erasure was part of a larger system of gender inequality. By re-examining historical sources, feminist scholars began to uncover the ways in which women exercised power within their homes, communities, and religious institutions. Women such as Hildegard of Bingen, Christine de Pizan, and Eleanor of Aquitaine, once overlooked or reduced to mere footnotes, were given the attention they deserved as powerful leaders, intellectuals, and visionaries who shaped the course of history. Academic work dedicated to rewriting the narrative surrounding medieval women has grown significantly over the last few decades. Feminist historians have made groundbreaking strides in uncovering and interpreting medieval texts that had previously been dismissed or underexplored. They have revisited chronicles, letters, legal documents, and religious manuscripts, offering new perspectives on the lives and contributions of women in the Middle Ages. Works such as Women in the Middle Ages by British historian M.M. Postan and the Medieval Woman, an introduction by Eileen Power, have been instrumental in making these rediscovered histories more accessible to the public. Additionally, feminist scholars have sought to challenge the narratives constructed by male historians, offering counter-narratives that focus on women's roles in politics, culture, and the economy. One of the most significant breakthroughs in feminist medieval studies has been the recognition that women were not just passive subjects of history, but active agents who shaped the course of events in subtle, often covert ways. The study of women's roles in medieval politics has revealed how queens, noblewomen, and even commoners influenced the political landscape of their time. Women like Margaret of Anjou, who played a pivotal role in the Wars of the Roses, or Blanche of Castile, who ruled as regent for her son, Louis IX, are now recognized as key political figures in their own right, not just as figures defined by their relationships with men. By re-examining these women's lives, feminist historians have illuminated how medieval women navigated and manipulated the political systems around them, often from behind the scenes, to safeguard their families, assert their authority, and influence major political decisions. Moreover, feminist scholars have expanded the scope of research to include women in religious life, an area where their influence was often dismissed or obscured. Medieval women played essential roles in the development of religious thought and practice. Figures like Teresa of Avila, Catherine of Siena, and Julian of Norwich were not only spiritual leaders but also theologians and mystics, whose writings and ideas have had a lasting impact on Christian theology. Despite being subjected to the limitations of their time, these women found ways to shape religious discourse, offering new interpretations of faith, suffering, and salvation. Feminist historians have ensured that their intellectual contributions are not overlooked, making their voices central to the understanding of medieval religious culture. The feminist movement's role in uncovering these forgotten histories has also had a profound impact on modern cultural representations of women. The increased visibility of medieval women's stories in academic studies, literature, and popular media has given rise to a reimagining of women's roles in history. Documentaries, historical fiction, and films have started to portray powerful medieval women more accurately, focusing not just on their personal relationships, but on their intellectual, political, and spiritual leadership. Shows like The White Queen and books like The Red Queen by Philippa Gregory, while fictionalized, have brought to light the complexities of women's lives in the medieval world, and have sparked a broader interest in the historical figures whose stories have been ignored for centuries. This rediscovery of medieval women's histories has also had a significant impact on contemporary feminist movements. As modern feminists look to the past for inspiration and guidance, they find in the stories of women like Eleanor of Aquitaine, Joan of Arc, and Christine de Pizan a reminder of women's resilience and agency in times of adversity. The resurgence of these historical narratives provides a powerful counterpoint to the contemporary struggles for gender equality, demonstrating that women have always had the ability to shape the world around them, even when society sought to limit their power. The work of feminist scholars is far from finished, and the struggle to reclaim these lost histories continues. Yet, the progress that has been made in recent decades has been transformative, not just in terms of how we understand the medieval past, but in how we view the roles of women in the present. By challenging traditional historical narratives, feminist historians have opened the door to a new understanding of women's contributions to history, one that acknowledges their power, resilience, and profound impact on the world. This section leads us into the next chapter, where we will explore the broader societal implications of these discoveries. The rediscovery of medieval women's roles is not just an academic pursuit, it is part of a global movement that challenges conventional ideas of power and influence. As we continue to uncover these forgotten histories, we see how they resonate with modern struggles for gender equality and women's empowerment, shaping the cultural and political conversations of today. What if medieval women are finally getting the screen time they deserve? The stories that were once forgotten are now making a comeback, and their long overdue presence in modern media is reshaping how we view history. Over the past few decades, film, television, literature, and digital platforms have played a significant role in revising and reimagining the narratives of medieval women. These women, often relegated to the background or erased entirely in traditional historical accounts, are now being given their rightful place at the center of the story. From historical dramas to modern reinterpretations, the women of the Middle Ages are no longer mere footnotes. They are the subjects of powerful, compelling narratives that challenge outdated stereotypes and provide a more balanced view of history. Historical dramas and documentaries have been at the forefront of this cultural shift, bringing to life the complex lives and contributions of medieval women. Shows like The White Queen and The Last Kingdom have not only brought attention to the roles women played in shaping dynastic struggles and political alliances, but they have also given depth to their personal stories. These programs focus on the challenges faced by women like Elizabeth Woodville, Joan of Arc, and other historical figures, showcasing their strength, intelligence, and resilience. By centering women in these stories, modern media is challenging the traditional narrative that often depicted women as passive participants in the backdrop of male-dominated historical events. Documentaries have also played an important role in this transformation, with modern filmmakers and historians working to reclaim the histories of women like Hildegard of Bingen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and Margaret of Anjou. These documentaries not only educate viewers about these women's achievements, but also raise awareness about the gender biases that have long shaped historical records. By presenting these women as active, multifaceted figures, rather than mere supporters or consorts, the media is rewriting how we understand the medieval world, one story at a time. Modern literature has also embraced the task of reimagining medieval women's stories, with authors and historical fiction writers bringing these forgotten figures to the forefront. Books like Philippa Gregory's The Red Queen and The White Queen have explored the lives of powerful medieval women, such as Margaret of Anjou and Elizabeth Woodville, presenting them as complex, capable women caught in the turbulent politics of their time. These works are not only entertaining but also serve as a powerful reminder of the agency women held in an era that has often been viewed through a male-centric lens. Literature allows these women's voices to be heard once more, offering readers a new perspective on their historical significance. Digital platforms and social media have played an equally important role in the resurgence of medieval women's stories. Platforms like YouTube and podcasts dedicated to history have provided space for in-depth explorations of forgotten women's lives. These platforms offer accessible ways for audiences to learn about historical figures whose contributions have often been overshadowed by male-dominated narratives. Social media also fosters a space for communities of people passionate about reclaiming women's histories to come together, share information, and amplify these voices. The growing prominence of medieval women in media also speaks to a broader cultural shift, one that challenges the traditional narratives that have shaped our understanding of history. As more stories of women's power, intellect, and influence are brought to light, we see a more balanced portrayal of the past. This shift is important not only because it corrects historical oversights, but because it also fosters a more inclusive understanding of power and influence. These representations of medieval women are helping to dismantle the outdated stereotypes that have long constrained our ideas about gender and power, showing that women have always been at the forefront of shaping history, whether in the public or private sphere. The impact of these media shifts is particularly evident in how they inspire new generations of women to reconnect with their own power. By seeing women from the medieval period portrayed as warriors, leaders, intellectuals, and rebels, modern audiences are reminded that women have always had the capacity to shape the world around them. These stories offer women today new role models, figures who overcame obstacles, challenged systems of power, and left lasting legacies. They encourage a broader cultural conversation about what it means to be a powerful woman, both in history and in the present. However, while these portrayals are vital, the question remains, are these cultural shifts enough? Are we truly doing justice to the depth and complexity of these women's legacies? Or are we still painting their stories with the same broad brush that has historically overshadowed their contributions? As the stories of medieval women continue to surface, it's crucial to consider not only how they are represented, but also the broader societal impacts of these revisions. This section leads us into the next chapter, where we will delve deeper into the societal implications of these historical revisions, exploring how they are reshaping the modern cultural and political landscape, particularly in terms of gender equality and women's empowerment. The question remains, how far will this cultural shift take us, and what will be the long-term effects on our understanding of history? What if uncovering the lost histories of medieval women is the key to understanding the full picture of human history? We've been taught half the story until now. The rediscovery and retelling of medieval women's histories is not merely a matter of recovering forgotten facts, it is a critical step toward reshaping how we understand the past and how that understanding shapes our present and future. History has always been a tool that cultures use to define their values, reinforce their ideologies, and frame their identities. But what happens when the dominant historical narrative leaves out half of the population? By reclaiming the lost stories of medieval women, we have the opportunity to reframe history in a way that reflects the true complexity of human experience and helps us build a more inclusive future. The historical narratives we've inherited have been shaped by centuries of patriarchal thinking. For much of history, women's voices were silenced, their contributions marginalized or erased entirely. The stories we know best, the tales of kings, warriors, and male philosophers have defined our cultural ideals of power, leadership, and influence. But these narratives are incomplete. By focusing almost exclusively on men's actions, traditional histories have minimized or ignored the roles that women played in shaping society, culture, and politics. This has resulted in a distorted understanding of history, where women are often relegated to the margins, if they are acknowledged at all. The consequences of this omission are profound. History is not just a collection of past events, it is a framework through which societies understand themselves. The way we view power, gender, and societal roles today is deeply influenced by the historical narratives that have been passed down to us. If we continue to ignore the contributions of half of humanity, we risk perpetuating a skewed understanding of the past, one that continues to shape modern cultural values and societal norms. By rediscovering and retelling the stories of medieval women, we can begin to fill in the gaps of our historical consciousness and create a more accurate, inclusive representation of the past. This process of historical rediscovery is not simply an academic exercise. It is a vital cultural endeavor that has the potential to transform our understanding of human agency and power. Medieval women, whether as political leaders, intellectuals, or spiritual figures, were active participants in the shaping of their worlds. From queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine and Margaret of Anjou, to mystics like Hildegard of Bingen and writers like Christine de Pizan, these women exercised significant influence, often in ways that were invisible or minimized by the dominant narratives of their time. Their stories are not just interesting historical footnotes, they are essential to understanding how power was distributed, how societies functioned, and how cultural values were formed. Retelling the histories of these women allows us to challenge outdated assumptions about gender and power. It forces us to confront the ways in which historical narratives have been shaped by exclusion and erasure. More importantly, it invites us to rethink what power really looks like. Women in the medieval world wielded power in ways that were often different from the traditional forms of male authority through diplomacy, intellectual leadership, spiritual influence, and even covert political maneuvering. By recognizing these forms of power, we broaden our understanding of leadership and influence, expanding the possibilities for how power is exercised and understood today. The process of reclaiming women's histories also has the potential to impact the present. By rediscovering these lost stories, we begin to see the continuity of women's contributions across time, from the medieval period to the modern world. This not only gives women role models and inspiration, but also challenges contemporary ideas about women's roles in society. Just as medieval women overcame societal barriers to exercise power and influence, modern women can find strength in their ancestors' resilience and determination. In reclaiming these lost histories, we help future generations understand that women have always been capable of shaping the world, even when history tried to erase their contributions. However, the consequences of ignoring these histories are also significant. When we fail to acknowledge the full scope of human history, especially the roles women have played, we continue to reinforce the gender inequalities that still persist in modern society. These erasures perpetuate harmful stereotypes about women's abilities, reinforcing the idea that women's contributions are secondary to those of men. By not learning from the past, we risk repeating the same mistakes and continuing to undervalue women's roles in shaping the world. This is why rediscovering and retelling these histories is so crucial. It allows us to learn from the past in a way that empowers women and helps build a more equitable future. Cultural memory plays a powerful role in shaping societal values, and history is a key component of that memory. As we begin to reclaim the lost histories of medieval women, we are not just changing how we understand the past, we are transforming how we envision the future. By integrating women's stories into the historical narrative, we create a more complete, nuanced understanding of human history, one that acknowledges the contributions of all people, regardless of gender. This process of rediscovery and retelling is part of a broader societal movement toward inclusivity and equality, helping to break down the barriers that have historically kept women's voices from being heard. As we move into the next section, we will examine the broader societal implications of this cultural shift. The rediscovery of women's roles in history is not just about revising textbooks or retelling old stories. It is a catalyst for lasting cultural transformation. By acknowledging and celebrating the contributions of women, we are challenging the conventional ideas of power, influence, and leadership, paving the way for a more inclusive future. This cultural revolution, rooted in the past, will continue to shape the way we think about gender, power, and equality in the modern world. Could the rediscovery of medieval women's roles lead to a new feminist revolution? What happens when the forgotten histories of women come to life? The uncovering of medieval women's stories has not only revealed the hidden contributions of women to society, but has also become a catalyst for a broader cultural and feminist shift. As these women's voices resurface, modern feminists are embracing the power of their legacies to challenge traditional gender roles, reshape societal expectations, and fuel ongoing movements for gender equality. This shift is not only empowering women, but also inspiring a re-examination of gender dynamics in every aspect of contemporary life, from politics to entertainment, business, and education. At the heart of this cultural revolution is the realization that women have always been active, powerful agents of change, even when their contributions were silenced or forgotten. The stories of medieval women, from queens and political strategists like Eleanor of Aquitaine and Margaret of Anjou, to mystics and intellectuals like Hildegard of Bingen and Christine de Pizan, have provided modern feminists with a historical foundation upon which to build a new narrative. By reclaiming these women's voices and acknowledging their roles in shaping history, feminists are challenging the traditional idea that power, influence, and leadership are inherently male qualities. These rediscovered histories provide a counter-narrative to centuries of gendered assumptions, showing that women have always been at the forefront of cultural, political, and intellectual movements. This feminist renaissance has sparked a re-evaluation of gender roles across society. Women's contributions are no longer seen as incidental or secondary, but are recognized as fundamental to shaping the social, political, and cultural fabric of society. In politics, the recognition of powerful women in history has inspired contemporary female leaders who are working to carve out spaces of influence and create policies that address gender inequality. Figures like Malala Yousafzai, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Jacinda Ardern, to name a few, have drawn strength from the legacies of women who defied the odds in their time, proving that women have always had the potential to shape the world. These modern leaders are pushing boundaries in ways that parallel the defiance of women like Hildegard or Christine, who challenged the gender norms of their own eras. The feminist movement's cultural impact is also evident in entertainment, where women's stories are finally being told with the complexity and depth they deserve. Television series like The Last Kingdom and Vikings are bringing medieval women's stories to the screen, showing not just their roles as wives or consorts, but as leaders, warriors, and intellectuals. The popular Netflix show The Queen's Gambit is a modern example of how female stories of strength, resilience, and intellectual brilliance are now being celebrated. These portrayals reflect a cultural shift, where women's power is no longer viewed as a novelty, but as a normalized and celebrated part of history and society. In business, the modern feminist movement is similarly drawing from the past to reshape expectations and challenge barriers. Women in leadership positions, like Sheryl Sandberg, CEO of Facebook, and Indra Nooyi, former CEO of PepsiCo, are proving that women can excel in industries that have traditionally been dominated by men. As these women rise to prominence, they echo the contributions of medieval women who, through intelligence, diplomacy, and sheer determination, navigated and shaped their own domains. The rediscovery of these women's stories highlights how women in the past, though often relegated to the background, were just as influential in driving their societies forward. Education, too, is beginning to incorporate these forgotten histories, with universities and schools increasingly offering courses on the overlooked contributions of women in history. The feminist shift has encouraged a generation of students to question traditional historical narratives and to seek out the untold stories of women who shaped the world. Through this academic shift, young people are learning not just about the past, but about the possibilities for the future. The next generation of students is being taught that women have always had the capacity for leadership and influence, and that their contributions, once erased, are integral to understanding the full scope of human history. At the heart of this cultural transformation is the idea that gender equality is not just a modern issue, it is a historical one. The rediscovery of medieval women's stories forces us to confront the ways in which history has been shaped by exclusion and erasure. But it also provides a powerful reminder that women have always fought for agency, autonomy, and the right to shape their own destinies. The feminist movement today is not just about lifting up individual women, it is about rewriting the entire narrative of history, showing that women have always been central to the story. This shift in how we view women's roles in history is not just cultural, it has far-reaching implications for how we approach gender equality today. By acknowledging the full contributions of women to society, we are creating a more inclusive and accurate understanding of history. And as these histories are retold, they are inspiring new generations to continue challenging the status quo. The impact of this cultural transformation is already being felt, and it promises to reshape the world in ways we have yet to fully understand. As we move into the next chapter, we will explore how this rediscovery of women's roles is not just a cultural shift, it's a global movement that is affecting not only Western societies but cultures around the world. The effects of this historical revisionism are reshaping how we view power, gender, and identity, and they are paving the way for a future where gender equality is not just an aspiration, but a reality. This movement is rewriting history, but it is also creating a new narrative for the future. What if the future of history looks drastically different from what we've been taught? The next chapter in history is waiting to be written, and it holds the potential to fundamentally reshape how we understand gender, power, and leadership. The rediscovery of medieval women's histories marks the beginning of a new era, one in which the contributions of women are no longer erased or forgotten. As the historical record expands to include these often overlooked voices, future generations will have a more accurate and inclusive understanding of the past, one that reflects the true scope of human history. The implications of this shift are profound, offering the possibility of a world where women's stories are not just retold, but are integral to shaping the cultural, political, and social landscapes of the future. As we move forward, the continued efforts to uncover and recontextualize women's roles in history will have a far-reaching impact on how future generations perceive gender, power, and leadership. In a world where women's historical contributions are actively included and celebrated, young people, regardless of gender, will grow up with a much broader and more equitable view of what it means to be a leader, an intellectual, or a pioneer. Instead of the traditional historical narrative that often highlights male figures as the sole agents of change, we will see a fuller picture, one in which women are seen as equal contributors to the development of societies, economies, and cultures. This shift is not just about revising textbooks or adding more names to historical records, it's about changing the very way we think about gender roles. If women's achievements in medieval history are acknowledged as central to shaping the world of their time, it will create a new cultural framework for understanding gender today. The legacy of women like Hildegard of Bingen, Christine de Pizan, and Eleanor of Aquitaine, once hidden or downplayed, will serve as examples of strength, intellect, and resilience. These figures will no longer be outliers, but will instead be woven into the fabric of our shared history, challenging the notion that power and influence are reserved for one gender. The future generation will see leadership and innovation as qualities that transcend gender, offering a more inclusive and empowered vision of what is possible. In this new world, history, textbooks, media, and cultural narratives will reflect the full diversity of contributions that have shaped our world. No longer will women be sidelined in the footnotes or reduced to mere supporters of male-dominated achievements. Instead, the stories of women, whether queens, warriors, scholars, or mystics, will be told with the same depth and respect as those of their male counterparts. In the media, we will see historical dramas, documentaries, and literature that explore these women's complex lives and multifaceted roles. The portrayal of women in these stories will not be confined to stereotypes, but will offer rich, nuanced depictions that reflect their true impact on society. As the rediscovery of these women's stories continues to unfold, we will see the emergence of a more balanced historical narrative that acknowledges the vital contributions of both women and men. The impact of this cultural shift will also extend to other areas of society, from politics to business, education, and entertainment. The more women's historical contributions are recognized, the more society will value their role in shaping the present and the future. In politics, for example, the increased visibility of women leaders from the past will serve as inspiration for contemporary women to engage in public life and assume positions of power. This shift will encourage a new generation of women to take up leadership roles, secure in the knowledge that women have always had the capacity to lead and influence the course of history. In the business world, the celebration of medieval women's stories will challenge traditional power structures and encourage a broader definition of leadership. Women like Eleanor of Aquitaine, who navigated political alliances and managed vast territories, and Christine de Pizan, who defied the intellectual boundaries of her time, will be held up as role models for women today, who seek to break through glass ceilings and shatter stereotypes about what women can achieve. Their stories will serve as powerful reminders that women have always been active contributors to the economy, culture, and intellectual life. Perhaps the most important implication of rediscovering these histories is the potential for social and cultural transformation. As the stories of medieval women become more widely known, they will inspire a cultural shift that redefines how we view power, authority, and gender. This will influence how women are treated in all aspects of life, whether in the workplace, in politics, or in their personal relationships. By recognizing the strength and agency of medieval women, we will create a more egalitarian world where both men and women can thrive based on their abilities, talents, and contributions, rather than being restricted by outdated gender roles. The process of reclaiming these lost histories is not only about recovering the past, it is about building a better future. By acknowledging the full scope of women's historical contributions, we provide future generations with the tools to address modern issues like gender inequality, underrepresentation, and social justice. The power of retelling these stories lies not just in their ability to shed light on the past, but in their capacity to inspire change in the present and future. As we conclude this chapter, we move into the final section, where we will explore the broader societal and cultural shifts resulting from the rediscovery of medieval women's roles. The historical revisions we are undertaking today have the potential to reshape not only our understanding of the past, but also our vision for the future. The journey of rediscovery has only just begun, and as we continue to reframe the historical narrative, we pave the way for a more inclusive and equitable world. The next chapter will examine how these shifts are already affecting modern society, and how they are helping to create a future where gender equality is embedded in the understanding of history, culture, and society. What happens when the true history of women finally comes to light? The world will never look the same again. The journey of rediscovering and reclaiming the hidden histories of medieval women has not only uncovered long-forgotten stories, but has also illuminated the powerful potential of historical discovery to reshape how we understand past, the present, and the future. Throughout this documentary, we've unearthed the lives of women who were active participants in shaping their worlds. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Christine de Pizan, and many others whose contributions were buried by centuries of male-dominated narratives. By bringing their stories into the light, we not only correct historical oversights, but also open the door to a more inclusive, accurate representation of human history. This process of rediscovery challenges everything we've been taught about the past. For centuries, the traditional historical narrative, written mostly by men, focused predominantly on the actions of kings, warriors, and political leaders. It relegated women to passive roles, if they were acknowledged at all. This omission wasn't an accident, it was a deliberate effort to shape society's understanding of power and influence. By excluding women's contributions, the patriarchal system sought to reinforce the idea that power, intellect, and leadership were inherently male qualities. But as we've seen, women like Eleanor of Aquitaine, Christine de Pizan, and others were not only influential, but central to the development of their societies. Their lives and legacies were not anomalies, they were part of the broader fabric of human history. Their erasure was not a reflection of their lack of significance, but a reflection of the limitations of the historical narrative that failed to recognize their power. The significance of reclaiming these histories goes far beyond the correction of historical inaccuracies. It's about rethinking the very structures of power that have shaped the world we live in today. By unveiling the stories of medieval women, we are actively deconstructing the traditional gendered hierarchy that has so long defined what it means to be powerful, influential, and capable. When we acknowledge that women have always played central roles in politics, religion, intellectual pursuits, and social movements, we begin to see power not as a gendered construct, but as a human one. The legacies of these medieval women challenge the idea that leadership is something exclusive to men, and instead suggest that anyone, regardless of gender, has the potential to shape the course of history. This historical discovery also directly impacts our understanding of gender dynamics today. The stories of medieval women, from their intellectual achievements to their political maneuverings, provide powerful role models for contemporary women. These women defied societal constraints, pushing back against systems that sought to limit their influence, and their stories are a testament to the resilience, intelligence, and determination of women throughout history. The rediscovery of these histories offers a new narrative for modern women to draw strength from. These women didn't just survive, they thrived, and their legacies continue to resonate today. Furthermore, the act of reclaiming these hidden histories is an act of empowerment. It not only gives women their rightful place in the historical narrative, but also empowers future generations to see themselves as agents of change. Just as these medieval women navigated oppressive systems and reshaped their worlds, modern women can find inspiration in their resilience and their ability to effect change, even in the face of great adversity. By seeing these women as central figures in history, we offer young girls and women the chance to envision themselves as leaders, creators, and visionaries in their own right. The impact of this historical revisionism is already beginning to unfold in modern culture. From literature and film to politics and education, the stories of these women are being brought to the forefront. Television series like The Last Kingdom and Vikings have introduced audiences to powerful female characters who are not just passive bystanders in history, but active participants in shaping the events around them. Historical documentaries and books are exploring the lives of women who were once sidelined, giving them the attention they deserve, and sparking a broader conversation about the ways in which women have shaped the world. This shift in cultural narratives is not just about celebrating the achievements of women, it's about recognizing that women have always been integral to the development of civilization. As this new understanding of history takes root, it holds the potential to reshape the future. The more we acknowledge women's contributions, the more we challenge outdated gender stereotypes and the power structures that uphold them. In the future, we may see a world where gender equality is not just an ideal, but a reality, one where both women and men are seen as equally capable of leadership, creativity, and influence. The rediscovery of these women's stories is a crucial step in creating that world, as it allows us to dismantle the historical foundations of inequality and build a more just and inclusive society. The process of rediscovering and retelling women's histories is a dynamic, ongoing journey. It's not simply about correcting the historical record, it's about creating a future where all people, regardless of gender, you can see themselves as active participants in shaping the world. This work is part of a broader cultural revolution that seeks to challenge and rewrite the dominant narratives of history, moving us toward a more inclusive and equitable future. The stories of these women, once forgotten, are now being reclaimed and integrated into the larger narrative of human history, offering a new vision of power, leadership, and equality. As we conclude this documentary, we can reflect on the transformative power of historical discovery. By uncovering the lost histories of medieval women, We not only enrich our understanding of the past, but also create a foundation for a better, more inclusive future. The true history of women is not just waiting to be uncovered, it is waiting to change the world. And as we continue this process of rediscovery, we can only imagine the far-reaching effects it will have on the generations to come. The next chapter in history is waiting to be written, and it will be one that honors the contributions of all people, both women and men equally. The journey doesn't end here, history is still waiting to be discovered. Are you ready to be part of it? The rediscovery of women's histories, particularly those of medieval women whose contributions were once erased or obscured, is an ongoing process, one that requires the collective effort of historians, educators, and individuals like you. We've explored the rich legacies of figures like Hildegard of Bingen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and Christine de Pizan, and we've seen how their stories are reshaping our understanding of the past. But this is just the beginning. The full complexity of history is still waiting to be uncovered, and as we continue this quest, there is an urgent need for all of us to be involved in this transformative process. The work of uncovering lost histories is not solely the responsibility of professional historians or academics. It is a task that belongs to each of us, historians, educators, researchers, and even the average person with a passion for history. Every single one of us can contribute to the movement of uncovering forgotten stories and giving voice to those whose lives have been hidden by time. In today's world, where access to information is more widespread than ever before, we have the power to reshape how history is understood, taught, and remembered. It is up to us to ensure that the future is built on a more inclusive understanding of the past, one where the contributions of women are acknowledged and celebrated alongside those of men. Modern historians have already made great strides in revising the historical record to include women's roles, but there is still much work to be done. Many historical documents remain unexplored, and countless stories are still waiting to be uncovered. New sources, artifacts, and manuscripts continue to emerge, offering fresh insights into the lives of medieval women, their power, and their influence. As technology continues to advance, historians are able to use innovative methods to uncover new historical materials that may have been hidden in archives, forgotten in dusty libraries, or ignored by previous generations. The ongoing quest for lost histories is a dynamic, evolving process that invites anyone with a passion for history to contribute to it. But it's not just about recovering forgotten stories, it's about reimagining how we understand and interpret history itself. History is not a fixed narrative, it is constantly being reshaped as new voices are added, new perspectives are considered, and new discoveries are made. Modern educators have a crucial role in this process by teaching the next generation to think critically about the sources of history they encounter. They must encourage students to question the narratives they've been taught and challenge the assumptions that have shaped historical scholarship. By teaching students to look beyond the traditional, male-dominated historical narratives and explore the stories of women, marginalized groups, and those who have been silenced, educators help to create a more inclusive history that reflects the complexity of human experience. For individuals, there are numerous ways to contribute to the ongoing search for lost histories. One of the most powerful things you can do is to support the work of historians, writers, and researchers who are dedicated to uncovering these hidden stories. Read the books, watch the documentaries, and follow the work of those who are at the forefront of this movement. By engaging with these stories and sharing them with others, you help ensure that women's contributions are no longer erased or overlooked. Share these stories with friends, colleagues, and social media communities, and encourage others to seek out the histories that have been ignored. Amplifying these voices is a crucial part of the process of reclaiming history. Additionally, there are opportunities for anyone to engage in the work of uncovering lost histories. Archives and libraries often welcome volunteers who assist in digitizing old manuscripts or transcribing documents that may contain hidden stories. You can also contribute by exploring historical texts and searching for references to women and other marginalized groups that have been overlooked in traditional historical studies. If you have an interest in genealogy or local history, you might explore the histories of women in your own community, many of whom have been overlooked in traditional historical narratives. Each new discovery, no matter how small, adds to the larger picture of a more inclusive history. In the digital age, we also have the power to create new spaces for storytelling. Through blogs, podcasts, and social media platforms, people can share their own research, insights, and stories about forgotten women in history. The accessibility of digital platforms means that anyone, anywhere, can contribute to the conversation and bring these stories to a wider audience. The internet is a powerful tool for democratizing history, allowing us to break free from the constraints of traditional historical institutions and make history a living, breathing entity that belongs to everyone. As we move forward, it is important to remember that the work of rediscovering history is not just about recovering the past, it's about reshaping the future. When we acknowledge the full complexity of history, when we give voice to the women, communities, and individuals who have been silenced or marginalized, we create a more accurate, equitable foundation for the future. This cultural shift challenges the traditional power structures that have dominated our understanding of history and opens the door for a more inclusive future where gender equality, cultural diversity, and social justice are central to the conversation. The future of history will be defined by the work we do today. The more we uncover and share the lost histories of medieval women and other marginalized groups, the more we reshape the cultural narratives that will define the next generations. History is not static, it's a living, evolving story that is always being written. The more we uncover, the more we realize that there is always more to discover, more to learn, and more to understand. By continuing the search for lost histories, we ensure that the stories of all people, regardless of gender, race, or background, are included in the ongoing narrative of humanity. This final call to action is not just a plea for historical accuracy, it is a call for cultural transformation. By actively engaging in the process of rediscovering and reimagining history, we can create a more inclusive, just world where all people have an equal place in the story. History is waiting to be discovered, and it's up to all of us to make sure that every voice is heard. The journey of rediscovery is far from over, it is only just beginning, and we all have a role to play.